Think you know medieval women, think again. Behind every castle wall and peasant hut was a story of pain, power, and silent rebellion. This is what history forgot to tell you. Think your first period was rough. At least you didn't have to explain it to a priest while hiding the bloody wool between your legs like a war crime. In medieval Europe, puberty wasn't a special moment with cupcakes and awkward mother-daughter talks. It was a biological betrayal, a sign that your womb was now public property and ripe for marriage negotiations. Welcome to womanhood, now shut up, bleed quietly, and don't stain the rushes on the floor. And if you cry, that's just proof you're hysterical, probably possessed. Let's get one thing straight, nobody talked about menstruation, not even other women. It was considered dirty, dangerous, and deeply demonic because of course it was. The church said it was Eve's punishment and the devil's favourite time to sneak into your soul. So instead of advice, girls got rumours. Don't look at chickens while you're bleeding, they'll die. Yes, this was actual advice. Somewhere a girl sobbed into her tunic because she made eye contact with a goose and thought she'd murdered it. Pads, tampons. Try. A raggedy lump of linen shoved awkwardly between your thighs changed when it started to smell more like a battlefield than a body. Poorer women often used nothing at all, just bled into their clothes, and hoped no one noticed, which was impossible, because medieval clothes were basically beige napkins and everyone lived on top of each other. Oh, and guess what? They reused those linen cloths. No detergent, no bleach, just a bucket of river water, and a hope that the blood washed off along with the shame. If you think laundry sucks, now imagine scrubbing period stains next to your neighbour's chamber pot. You want horror. Imagine having your first period in a cold stone room with no heat, no privacy, and a dead bat in the rafters for ambiance. You'd wake up legs sticky, unsure if you were dying cursed or simply becoming a real woman. There were no pamphlets, no biology classes, just superstition and vague whispers from your equally terrified older sister. Your mother might tell you it means God is punishing you, but it also means it's time to get married. Great. Nothing says girlhood like blood and betrothal. And let's talk about how medieval people thought periods worked. According to learned men who'd never seen a uterus but felt confident explaining it, the womb was a wild beast. It wandered the body. Sometimes it strangled your heart. Sometimes it just screamed for babies. Periods were its way of throwing a tantrum. One medical theory claimed women had to bleed monthly because they were too soft and wet and needed to release their excess evil humours. Another said periods were nature's way of draining the poison from your body. Cute. Doctors, or more accurately bearded guessers with a book and a bowl of leeches, prescribed absurd cures for menstrual irregularity. These included goat dung poultices, eel broth, and dried toad powder. Yes, toads. Dried, ground, and spoon-fed. If that didn't fix you, you might be told to dance, drink wine, or my personal favourite carry-roasted cat testicles in your pocket. I swear I'm not making this up. Women bled and bled while men wrote books about demon-possessed uteruses and feline fertility magic. And God forbid your period was different. Bleed too much, you were cursed. Bleed too little, infertile. Bleed on the wrong day of the moon, literal witch. Women who didn't menstruate properly were suspected of sin illness or sorcery. You could get exorcised for a heavy flow. And if you bled during pregnancy, that was either a miscarriage, a ghost baby, or punishment for touching yourself. None of these are great options. Let's do a quick modern comparison. Today you can go on TikTok and find 3,000 influencers explaining your cycle in bright lighting with gentle music and uterus-shaped tea infusers. In the Middle Ages, you got the village priest telling you menstruating women shouldn't touch holy bread or speak in church because their very breath could rot crops. Women were banned from religious rites while menstruating because obviously the devil travels via ovary. If you lived in a monastery, things got weirdly specific. Some nuns were allowed to write during their periods but weren't allowed to speak. Others had to sleep on the floor. One 12th century abbey believed menstruation was the monthly murder of potential souls and required public confession every time it happened. Imagine being 12 and having to say, "Forgive me, Father, I bled again." Meanwhile, Brother Gregory is downing wine and lighting incense like nothing happened. And remember, bleeding didn't stop anyone from working. No menstrual leave in the sheep fields. You still had to churn butter, gut fish, bake bread, and pretend not to be hemorrhaging in front of your in-laws. If you passed out from blood loss, someone would just throw vinegar at your face and tell you to pray harder. Fainting was considered weak, but it was also considered feminine, so they just called you dramatic and moved on. One popular solution to avoid the mess entirely: pregnancy. That's right. Some women deliberately got pregnant repeatedly so they wouldn't have to deal with periods. Of course, that meant more childbirths and higher chances of death. But hey, at least you weren't unclean once a month. Better dead than menstruating. That's how medieval logic worked. There was also a brief window where people believed period blood had magical properties. It could wilt flowers, sour wine, and kill bees. That's not an exaggeration. A 13th century French medical text said, "A menstruating woman who walks through a field will cause the seeds not to grow." Another suggested that dogs who tasted menstrual blood would go mad and bark at the moon. Science. Even the language around periods was wild. No one said "I'm on my period." It was euphemisms galore. The curse, the monthly illness, the red flow. One poem from the 14th century describes a woman harrowed by the tide of Eve's sorrow. That's the most dramatic way to say "I need a tampon" I've ever heard. Let's pause for a moment of gratitude. You reading this probably have access to Advil hot water bottles and a clean bathroom, maybe even chocolate. In the Middle Ages, women had none of that, and still managed to raise kids, survive plagues, and not scream constantly. Honestly, they deserve a parade, or at least a sitcom. So next time you get cramps and someone says it could be worse, feel free to say yes. It could be 1347, I could be scrubbing blood out of my only tunic with cold ditch water, while a priest calls me unholy. Because that's not exaggeration. That's just history. Menstruation in the Middle Ages wasn't just messy, it was political. It was used to justify why women were weak, sinful, and unfit for power. Kings held swords. Queens held secrets about when they could safely go to mass. If you bled, you were less. That was the rule. And yet, they endured. They survived. They passed down herbs, whispered remedies, taught each other how to cope in silence. They stitched knowledge into embroidery and scraped truth into margins of prayer books. Some even became saints, bleeding broken and still defiant. In a world where your body was a liability, survival itself was rebellion. But before you get too inspired, don't forget the goat dung poultices. Let's not romanticize it too much. Let's set the scene. You wake up in a small, damp, smoke-filled medieval hut. You slept in your clothes because changing was a twice-a-year event and something is crawling on your scalp. It's not a nightmare. It's just Tuesday. Welcome to hygiene in the Middle Ages, where lice were roommates, fleas were accessories, and the word soap was more of a suggestion than a reality. Baths. Oh, honey. Not unless you were rich, royal, or recently exercised. Even then, the bath was often a tub of lukewarm water shared by the entire household, in order of importance. So yes, Papa got in first, Mama second, then the kids, then the baby, and finally the water was so murky it had the consistency of medieval stew. There's a reason the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bath water" exists. It's not a metaphor, it's a warning. Now let's talk about smell. Medieval people stank, and not in a forgot deodorant today kind of way. We're talking fermented armpits, week-old bread breath, and the unmistakable tang of wet wool mixed with unwashed genitals. Perfume was less a luxury, and more a survival tool for others. Women stuffed lavender into their bodices just to mask the odour of breasts that hadn't seen clean cloth since Easter. Think about that next time you complain about a co-worker's cologne, and the hair long, luscious and teeming with things Lice were so common that people carved intricate ivory lice combs as gifts. Nothing says I love you like a handcrafted parasite scraper. People wore head coverings not for fashion, but to contain the infestation. And no shampoo didn't exist. You'd rinse your hair maybe with rainwater or vinegar, then brush it with a comb you shared with your entire village. If you didn't go bald by 30, it was considered witchcraft. Tooth care, ha. Best case you rubbed your teeth with a cloth soaked in ashes, salt or wine. Worst case you lost them all before age 25 and replaced them with splinters and prayer. Toothaches were treated by, wait for it, drilling a hole in the skull to release the demons. No anaesthesia, just vibes. You want perspective. Next time you whine about dental floss, remember medieval dentistry was basically carpentry on the human face. Let's move to the feet, because if you thought armpits were bad, wait until you sniffed medieval boots. People never took off their shoes unless they were sleeping. Some didn't even do that. Socks were luxury items. Fungus was community property. Toenail clippers. Try a dull knife or your teeth. That's right. People bit their own toenails. I'll give you a moment to recover from that image. Now, if you needed to relieve yourself, you had two options: chamber pot or public shame. Chamber pots were bowls you squatted over indoors and then tossed out the window with a casual gardyloo, which translates to look out for the flying feces. If you were outside, you aim for a river, a bush or an alley. London was known for its buttways, literal poop channels carved into streets. It smelled exactly as you think it did. Medieval cities were paved with filth. Horse dung, human waste, rotting fish, spilled ale. It was a sensory experience from hell. Women had to lift their skirts and tiptoe through the sludge like they were auditioning for Swan Lake in manure. It wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Sewage carried plague parasites and the occasional drowning peasant. Yes, people fell into cesspits and died. That was a thing. Speaking of which, latrines. If your village was fancy, you had a wooden seat built over a pit. If you were royal, maybe a stone bench with a hole. Castles had garderobes, vertical shafts that dropped poop straight down the walls. It sounded clever until the wind blew upward and gave you a royal surprise. And yes, sometimes servants had to clean the pit with their hands, for pennies. If you're grossed out, imagine doing it in August. Women had it worse. Public urination was risky. You had to squat hike up 7 layers of skirt, pray no one saw your bits and avoid splashing your shoes. In some places, women used urine funnels made of wood or horn to pee standing up. Think of it as the original go-girl, only medieval and splintery, wiping moss straw cloth scraps or your hand. There were no rules, just improvisation and regret. So why didn't people bathe more? Because for a while they did. In early medieval times, public bathhouses were everywhere. People soaked, gossiped, and sometimes did other things. But then the church got involved and declared baths sinful. Clean skin apparently led to dirty thoughts. So by the 14th century, most public baths were shut down or repurposed into brothels. You could get syphilis or salvation depending on the hour. Let's not forget disease. Bubonic, plague, typhus, dysentery all spread faster than gossip at a convent. And most of it could have been slowed by washing hands, cleaning clothes or boiling water. But people didn't know that. Germ theory was still 600 years away. Instead, they blamed bad smells, angry planets, or Jews. Hygiene wasn't just poor, it was non-existent, and the consequences were brutal. But don't worry, there were solutions. To cleanse yourself spiritually, you could fast flog yourself or walk barefoot through snow. To cleanse yourself physically, you could rub with dry bread, beat your body with herbs, or get buried in ash. One recipe for holy cleansing advised women to bathe in wine and chant psalms while standing naked in a bucket. Effective number entertaining? Absolutely. Let's compare to modern life. Today we have shower gels with lavender oil and pH-balanced vaginal washes. We have dentists who don't use chisels and toilets that flush. Medieval women had chamber pots, leeches and dried rose petals shoved into their sleeves to distract from the smell of decay. You get scented candles. They got incense to cover the scent of death. It's not even close. What's wild is that they thought they were clean. They genuinely believed that wiping their hands on the wall or spritzing with rosewater was sufficient. Some aristocrats believed washing too often weakened the body. King Louis XIV reportedly bathed twice in his entire life. Twice. And somehow he still had mistresses. Either noses didn't work back then or desperation was stronger than dignity. And guess what? The church encouraged stink. Saints were praised for being fragrant in soul and fetid in flesh. One nun was said to be so holy her rotting body smelled like lilies. Another locked herself in a closet for 30 years and claimed the lice were her blessed companions. Hygiene wasn't just ignored, it was actively punished. Smelling nice meant you were vain. Smelling like rot that was divine. But medieval women, God bless them, still tried. They boiled herbs, sewed sachets of lavender, brushed their hair 100 strokes to keep lice away. They invented tonics, perfumers, salves. They taught each other how to wash discreetly, how to reuse cloth, how to survive in filth with some dignity. They didn't have soap, but they had solidarity and desperation. So next time you light your eucalyptus candle, exfoliate with sea salt scrub and step into a warm rainfall shower. Just remember, somewhere in 1325, a woman was scraping cow dung off her shoes with a spoon and calling it a Tuesday. And she still managed to raise 5 kids, survive 3 plagues and bake bread with her bare hands while stinking like a compost bin in July. That's not just hygiene history, that's medieval heroism. Let's play a game. Imagine you're 13. You just started your period last year. Your biggest concern should be acne, or whether the neighbour's boy likes your new braid. But nope. In medieval Europe, congratulations, you're officially marriage material. A middle-aged man with questionable hygiene, 4 teeth, and a solid income just traded 2 goats and a sack of grain for your entire future. Welcome to the holy institution of medieval marriage, where the contract mattered more than the girl inside it. Romance. That's adorable. This wasn't a love story. It was a livestock transaction dressed in lace. You weren't a person. You were an asset. Families married off daughters, like they were inventory going stale. She's bleeding. Great, sign the contract before she stops. Your father didn't walk you down the aisle. He handed you over like a receipt. The ceremony wasn't a celebration. It was a business merger with incense. Here's the truth. Most medieval marriages were arranged, and the girl's opinion wasn't even on the table unless she screamed loud enough to scare the priest. Age of consent laws. Hilarious. In many parts of Europe, girls could legally marry at 12. 12. That's 6th grade. And while some waited a year or 2 before consummation, others didn't. The result, trauma dressed in a wedding veil and called God's will. The church naturally got involved. Because nothing screams spiritual guidance like blessing the union between a child and a grown man with back hair. Priests declared marriage a sacred bond, but mostly so they could regulate it and collect fees. Annulments, for example, were big business. Didn't like your wife claim she was your 4th cousin twice removed and boom, divorce by loophole. But if you were her, sorry. You're stuck unless you faked madness, grew a beard, or joined a convent. Let's talk dowries. A medieval dowry was the OG subscription fee. If your family couldn't afford one, you were basically unmarriageable. That meant either eternal spinsterhood, aka social exile, or being shoved into a nunnery where your best friends were guilt Latin and mild starvation. Dowries included money, land, clothing, furniture, sometimes livestock. Basically, please take our daughter, and here's a chicken to sweeten the deal. Now, if you were noble, things got even weirder. Marriages weren't just transactions, they were geopolitical chess moves. Your wedding might seal a treaty, claim a kingdom, or end a decades-long blood feud. There are records of babies being betrothed in cradles. Infant girls promised to boys they'd never meet unless one of them died of dysentery before puberty, which was honestly quite likely. Medieval dating apps were just scrolls with your family tree and land value. Love. If you were lucky. Most women didn't marry for affection, they married for survival. And once married, their bodies, money and legal status were absorbed into their husbands like a badly written contract. Couldn't own property, couldn't sue in court, couldn't even say no in bed because the idea of marital rape simply didn't exist. If he wanted sex, he got it. If you didn't, tough. That was your wifely duty right after sewing, baking, and not dying in childbirth. And the wedding night. Nightmare fuel, especially for young girls who might have no understanding of sex beyond vague warnings and terrifying metaphors. There are accounts of brides fainting, vomiting, even bleeding to death. Some noble families went full on Game of Thrones and invited witnesses to stand outside the bedroom to ensure the marriage was consummated. Nothing says eternal love like strangers listening for screams. Let's pause and appreciate modern problems. You worry about finding someone who texts back or doesn't ghost you. Medieval women worried about being married off before they hit puberty to a man with gout-3 illegitimate children and a sword collection. You get engagement rings. They got promises sealed with livestock and a prayer that he didn't already have the plague. And if your husband died, congrats. You're now a widow, which meant a tiny sliver of freedom. Unless his family stole your dowry, your children and your chickens. Some widows remarried for protection. Others were forced into remarriage like packages being rerouted. A few became wealthy landowners, but only if they played politics better than their dead husbands. Widowhood was the medieval version of she's single and thriving, except everyone still called you cursed. Now let's get specific. In England, women were expected to be obedient, silent and pious, preferably all three while producing male heirs. In Italy, noble women were sometimes locked in towers for safety until marriage, which is a very creative way to say domestic hostage. In France, brides were often tested for virginity before the wedding by midwives, because nothing says spiritual union like a gynecological exam conducted by candlelight. Of course, not all medieval women were victims. Some played the system like queens, literally. Eleanor of Aquitaine divorced her husband, ran her own court, and outlived nearly everyone who tried to control her. But for every Eleanor there were thousands of Julias, Maries and Agathas who were married off at 13, bore 10 children by 25, and died before 35 from something called childbed fever, or being a woman. And what if you didn't marry? If you were lucky, you became a nun. If you weren't, you became everyone's unpaid servant, social outcast, or a target of witchcraft accusations. Single women were threats because if they weren't under a man's control, they must be under Satan's. So the pressure to marry wasn't cultural. It was survival instinct wrapped in patriarchal propaganda. Let's revisit dowries one more time. If your father couldn't afford one, you might be sold into domestic servitude just to fund your sister's wedding. Or worse, you'd be married off to an old man nobody else wanted. In some towns, auction-style bride markets were real. Girls paraded before buyers like livestock. And if you complained, she's difficult. The medieval version of too much drama. So what's the takeaway? Medieval marriage wasn't sacred. It was strategic. A way to pass wealth, form alliances, control women and maintain bloodlines. The bride was often irrelevant. She was a womb with a face, a uterus on legs. Her feelings, dreams or trauma. Not even in the fine print. Now before we wrap this medieval bridal disaster, let's address the one good thing sometimes people did fall in love. There are rare letters, poems and songs where a husband praises his wife's laugh, her wit, her kindness. But those are the exceptions, precious and rare like gold coins in a dung heap. So next time someone says marriage was better back in the good old days, feel free to reply, yes. When girls were sold with goats, romance was a transaction and saying I do meant signing away your legal existence before you could even spell your name. Because that's the real wedding vow the Middle Ages, obey, bleed and don't complain. Food, the great comfort of life. Unless, of course, you're a medieval woman in charge of cooking it, in which case every meal is a game of will this kill me, or just mildly poison the children again. Because if there's one thing harder than surviving in the Middle Ages, it's cooking in them. There were no fridges, no nutrition labels, and no idea what a salmonella was, but by God, there were rats. So many rats. And they loved your kitchen more than your family did. Let's start with the kitchen itself if you had one. Most peasants didn't. They had a smoky corner of their one-room hut with a fire pit, a blackened pot, and dreams of not burning down the house again. Chimneys weren't common yet, so smoke just built up until it seeped out the thatched roof or your lungs. Women cooked while coughing, squinting through smoke and dodging falling ash flakes like medieval snow. Nothing says bon appetit like inhaling part of the ceiling with your stew. And speaking of stew, that was the dish. Every single day. It was called pottage, and it was a thick, boiling mystery of grains, beans, herbs, maybe a root vegetable if you didn't eat them all last week, and if you were lucky, a piece of meat smaller than your thumb. But don't worry, it had flavour. The flavour of desperation, smoke and whatever fell in when you weren't looking. Sometimes it simmered for days with new ingredients added in like a bubbling cauldron of edible anxiety. Meat was a luxury, unless you count the maggots which came free. Fresh meat spoiled fast, especially in summer, so preservation meant salting it until it resembled stone, or smoking it until it could outlive your great-grandchildren. There were no expiration dates, just vibes and the sniff test. And the sniff test wasn't reliable when you lived in a world that already smelled like rotting turnips and chamber pots. Sometimes you didn't know the meat was bad until someone died. Surprise. Let's talk about bread, the foundation of the medieval diet. Everyone ate it, peasants, nobles, monks. But not all bread was created equal. Rich folks got white bread made from sifted flour. Peasants got maslin, a gritty mess of barley, rye, oats, and occasionally ground up animal bones, bark or chalk. Yes, bones. Why? Because it added substance. And nothing says breakfast like biting into a chunk of grandma's leftover femur. Deliciously deadly. And the moulds. Bread often went mouldy within a day or two, and if you're thinking just cut off the bad part, guess what? Ergot the mould found on rye doesn't care where you slice. It contains a toxin that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and in some cases death. Whole villages tripped absolute medieval balls because of mouldy bread. Some historians even think the Salem witch trials were ergot's fault. So yeah, that's what was on the menu, panic and fungus. But don't worry, water was worse. Clean water was basically mythical. Wells were contaminated, rivers were full of sewage and rainwater collected in barrels with floating debris, and the occasional dead mouse. Women boiled water when they could, but fuel was scarce, and firewood was often wet or infested with bugs. So people drank ale all day, even kids, because getting tipsy was safer than getting cholera. Mothers literally brewed weak beer for toddlers. That's how bad the water situation was. Milk spoiled in hours, eggs rotten more often than not. Cheese harder than stone and usually full of mites. One traveller wrote that English cheese was so old and dry it could kill birds. Butter. A rare treat that went rancid if left near sunlight. So women did what they had to. They salted everything, dried it, buried it in cool cellars and prayed for frost. Spoilage was a daily threat. Food poisoning wasn't a possibility, it was an expectation. Now imagine doing all this while pregnant, barefoot, and with a toddler gnawing on your leg. Medieval women were expected to cook multiple meals a day, feed large families, manage the garden, keep chickens alive, and never ever complain. If the food was bad, her fault. If someone died from it, still her fault. If the stew was too thin, guess who's getting yelled at by a sweaty man with 3 teeth and a short temper? Ding, 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 it's you. Oh, and utensils. Forget it. Most people ate with their hands. Spoons were optional, knives were communal, and forks were considered demonic until the Renaissance. That's right, demonic. In some places, using a fork meant you were vain, foreign, or in league with the devil, so you tore your food with your fingers, passed the meat around, and hoped nobody sneezed directly onto the communal plate of whatever the hell that is. Let's not forget the bugs. Every meal was a buffet for flies, ants, and creepy crawlies with too many legs. Kitchens were breeding grounds. Food storage meant hanging stuff from the rafters and hoping the rats were too full from yesterday's barley. Some women used cat hair and garlic to keep pests away. Others just gave up and accepted that every meal had at least one winged protein bonus. Think of it as extra flavour. Or don't. Please don't. Now for a fun fact. Poison was a legitimate concern. Not just accidental, but intentional. In noble households, women sometimes had to taste test food before serving it, just in case someone tried to kill the Lord with arsenic soup. So imagine spending hours over a smoky fire stirring a pot of questionable stew, only to risk death because Uncle Geoffrey made enemies during that crusade he won't shut up about. Culinary ambition. No just medieval job hazard. Let's compare to today. Now you get HelloFresh delivered in eco-friendly packaging with pre-measured ingredients and a QR code that tells you how not to screw it up. Back then, medieval women cooked with instinct scraps and fire they begged from a neighbour if theirs went out. You microwave dinner. They walked 10 miles for onions. You Google recipes. They guessed. And if it went wrong, someone died. Still feeling brave, let's throw in medieval fast food. Yes, it existed. In big cities, you could buy meat pies, fish stew or fried rats from street vendors. But these were cooked in oils reused until they turned black over fires, fueled by dung and sold next to open drains. Bon appetit. If you were poor and starving, it was worth the risk. If you were rich, you still probably got diarrhea just in silk. Yet despite all this, despite the filth, the fires, the spoiled milk and evil bread medieval women kept cooking. Every day. No recognition. No choice. It was survival, sacrifice, and sometimes even art. They passed down recipes orally adjusted for seasons and somehow turned gruel into something warm. Food may have been terrifying, but it was also connection, family, ritual, even if it tasted like socks. So next time your soup is cold or the delivery guy forgets the sauce, maybe skip the tantrum. Because somewhere in the year 1243, a woman just pulled a live beetle out of her porridge, fed it to her husband and kept stirring. That's resilience. That's medieval cuisine. Let's start with the obvious. Nobody wanted 10 children. Not even in the Middle Ages. Sure, religious sermons glorified big families and men puffed their chests about many strong sons. But the women, the ones actually growing those sons, were begging for mercy. Childbirth wasn't a miracle. It was Russian roulette with a 50% chance of death and a 100% chance of peeing yourself forever. And yet birth control illegal, immoral, unavailable. Welcome to medieval family planning where your best option was to drink wine, pray, and maybe swallow a pebble. Let's break it down. The church said sex was only for procreation. Only. No pleasure, no fun. No, just because it's raining and I'm bored. And since the church basically ran everything from the law to your bed, that meant birth control, any birth control was a sin. A mortal one. Using contraception could get you excommunicated, which was like being unfriended by God and banned from brunch forever. So what did desperate women do? They got creative, which in medieval terms meant risky, painful, and sometimes deeply insane. Herbal contraception was the most popular route. Think wild carrot seeds, pennyroyal, rue, or tansy plants that work by poisoning your uterus just enough to maybe stop a pregnancy, but not enough to kill you. Usually. Pennyroyal tea, for instance, could terminate a pregnancy, and also your liver. It was like playing medicinal roulette with a teacup and a prayer, but the recipes, though they were something else. A 12th century herbal manual suggests wearing a mixture of crushed ants, boiled donkey fat and wine-soaked wool as a vaginal insert. Yep, that's real. Another recommended inserting a goose feather coated in honey and powdered turtle shell. Nothing says sexy like sticky birds and extinct reptiles. And don't forget the classic tying a weasel's testicle around your thigh. Because clearly weasels had something figured out. Some women wore amulets carved with prayers or astrological symbols, believing the moon's position could stop conception. Others carried dried frog bones in their skirts or slept with sacred stones under their pillows. The line between medicine and magic was blurrier than a monk's bathwater. And when none of that worked, when your uterus decided, yeah, I'm doing this, your options narrowed real fast. You give birth, or you risk your life trying not to. Let's talk abortion. Yes, it happened. Yes, people knew how. No, it wasn't safe. And no, it wasn't legal. Midwives often kept quiet recipes passed woman to woman, whispered in kitchens or muttered behind locked doors. Some involved drinking potions so bitter they'd make you vomit blood. Others required brutal physical methods, punching the stomach, jumping from heights, or inserting sharp objects. You think coat hangers are horrifying. Try splinters from a broomstick soaked in pig lard, and if the abortion failed, too bad. You'd carry to term give birth in a pile of straw with no help if you were unmarried and probably die from bleeding or infection. Unwed mothers were publicly shamed, whipped, and sometimes executed because clearly she seduced him. The man walked away. The woman got scarlet letters and still had to find dinner for two. Birth control wasn't just medical, it was survival. Let's not forget abstinence, because someone will say, why not just say no, cute? That assumes women had any say in sex. In marriage, refusing your husband was grounds for punishment or annulment. Outside marriage, the threat of assault was constant. Wealth didn't protect you. Poverty made it worse. You couldn't just lock your legs and cross your fingers. Sex was rarely about choice, and yet women tried. They tracked their cycles using moon phases, herbal signs, or sheer guesswork. Some practiced withdrawal, though let's be real, medieval men barely understood the mechanics, let alone the timing. Others douched with vinegar or salt water after sex, which burned like medieval hellfire and was about as effective as blowing on a volcano. The result, lots of babies, lots of deaths, lots of silent grief. Let's compare to modern life. Today you've got pills, implants, condoms, IUDs, patches, apps, and emergency contraception that doesn't involve amphibians. You have access to gynecologists, prenatal vitamins, and hospitals that don't double as haunted mansions. Back then, a woman's version of taking control was chewing parsley and hoping it made her infertile, instead of giving her diarrhea. She didn't have options. She had folk tales. And when a woman didn't want more kids, when her 10th pregnancy felt like a death sentence sometimes, she stopped trying to prevent it and started hoping she just wouldn't survive it. Maternal fatalism was real. Many women wrote prayers not for healthy babies, but for quick deaths. Let it be over swiftly. That was the dream. Not a baby, not joy, just survival without agony. There were bright spots, though, rare. In some places, female knowledge networks, midwives, healers, herbalists flourished in secret. They weren't witches. They were scientists without funding. They kept women alive through intuition, observation, and brutal trial and error. But the church hated them. Men feared them. And when a harvest failed or a baby died, guess who got blamed? Not God. Not the guy with the goat. The woman with the herbs. So how did medieval women cope? Humour, resistance, sisterhood. They joked about lazy husbands, hid contraceptive herbs in their gardens, and taught their daughters what to avoid quietly. Their power wasn't loud. It was coded, whispered, braided into hair and sewn into hem stitches. They carved space where none was given. They did what they had to. And yet people still say women back then were stronger. No, they weren't stronger. They were cornered. This endured because they had no choice. They survived because silence was safer than screaming. And when they did scream, it wasn't recorded. It was buried like so many of them beneath a churchyard cross, and a story that said she died of natural causes. As if any of this was natural. So next time you refill your birth control prescription, or scroll through contraceptive options like a brunch menu, take a second. Not to feel guilty, but to marvel. To whisper thanks. Not just to science, but to the unknown, forgotten women who chewed bitter roots in the dark so we wouldn't have to. Because back then the real plan B was Don't get caught. Forget everything you know about modern childbirth. Epidurals? Nope. Sanitized rooms? Not a chance. Doctors with clean gloves and medical degrees. Please. In the Middle Ages, giving birth was like stepping into a slasher film written by a priest with no script and no concept of anatomy. It was blood-screaming incense and maybe a midwife who once helped a pig deliver triplets. Welcome to Childbirth Medieval Edition rated R for reality, gore and God's will. You went into labour in your own home or hut or barn because hospitals were for the dying, not the birthing. A few women gathered around, usually relatives, or the local midwife who had hands like bark and eyes that had seen too much. They lit candles for the Virgin Mary, tossed herbs on the fire to calm spirits and hoped the baby didn't decide to come out backward. You lay on a straw mattress soaked with old blood and older prayers, gripping a wooden beam or someone's wrist hard enough to dislocate it. It was chaos wrapped in linen. There was no sterile equipment, no fetal monitoring, just guesswork and hope. If labour stalled, they gave you beer. If you fainted, they waved vinegar under your nose. If the baby was breech, they prayed harder, and sometimes pushed the baby back in to try again. Yes, back in. With bare hands. Midwives often performed miracles with nothing but rags' guts, and what little anatomy they had learned from watching goats. The line between birth and death was thinner than the cloth between your legs. Let's not sugarcoat this, many women died. From hemorrhage, infection, exhaustion, or simply from being too small to deliver a baby with a skull the size of a melon. Pelvises broke, bladders tore, blood loss was constant. Childbed fever, a bland name for raging bacterial infection, killed more women than actual disease. And there were no antibiotics, no IVs, no second chances. If you survived once, they sent you home to recover by churning butter and getting pregnant again. And the baby's half didn't make it. Stillbirths were common. Premature infants were considered cursed or weaklings. If a baby wasn't breathing, they might dunk it in cold water, slap it, or blow on it like a dying fire. If that didn't work, it was buried before the next bell rang. Sometimes even baptized in utero in case the mother and child died together. The goal wasn't a healthy baby, it was a living one. Bonus points if the mother didn't bleed to death. Now let's talk about caesarean sections. Yes, they existed, but not for live women. The C-section was a last resort usually performed after the mother had died or was definitely about to. It involved cutting into the womb with kitchen knives, zero anaesthesia, and a prayer that someone remembered how to sew. Most women didn't survive the attempt. The few who did were legends, or liars. Midwives, for all their skill, walked a dangerous line. If a birth went wrong, if a baby died, or a woman bled out, they could be accused of witchcraft. She mumbled in Latin while rubbing her hands with herbs clearly satanic. And yet these women were the only real help available. They knew how to turn babies, tie umbilical cords, soothe screaming mothers, and bury the dead when needed. They were heroes with dirty fingernails and no recognition. And then there was the church. God bless them literally. Religious officials had opinions about every stage of birth despite never having a uterus. They believed women suffered in childbirth as punishment for Eve's original sin. Pain wasn't just expected, it was required. Some theologians argue that too little pain meant the woman was sinning somehow. So no, you weren't allowed to ease your agony. Your screams were part of your repentance. On top of that, if a baby was born with any abnormality, missing limbs, strange birthmarks, even twins, people assumed it was a bad omen, or worse proof of a mother's immoral life. She laughed on the Sabbath clearly, that's why her baby has a crooked toe. There were even guides explaining how to spot a demon child. Spoiler, if your baby cried too loud, that was one of the signs. After birth, the ordeal wasn't over. You needed to be churched, a ritual purification for women who had given birth, because apparently childbirth made you spiritually dirty. Until then, you couldn't attend Mass or take communion. Never mind that you just created a human with your body and nearly died doing it, you were unclean. Just a reminder from society that your suffering was not sacred. It was suspicious. And let's talk postpartum care. Oh wait, there wasn't any. If your bleeding didn't stop, you were told to sit by a fire and pray. If your milk dried up, you were considered cursed. If your breasts became infected, you just suffered. Cracked nipples, mastitis, fever dreams, all while the baby cried and your husband demanded dinner. Some mothers didn't bond with their babies and no one understood why. She's lazy, they said. She's cold. No one had a name for postpartum depression. They just called you a bad mother and moved on. What did women do to protect themselves? Not much, but they tried. Amulets, herbal baths whispered charms. Some tucked tiny saints under their pillows. Others carved crosses into the headboards. But mostly they just endured. Braced their backs, screamed into straw and pushed. Some made it. Some didn't. And their names were forgotten, buried without markers, remembered only in the bodies of the children they barely lived to raise. Let's compare to modern childbirth. You have epidurals, prenatal vitamins, ultrasounds, doulas, birthing centres with mood lighting. You get options, pain management, clean sheets, sanitary tools, skilled surgeons, lactation consultants, room service. Back then you got boiling water superstitions and the same knife used to kill a pig last week. That was the bar. And yet people still romanticise the past. Women back then were tougher. No, they weren't tougher. They were trapped. They didn't get to opt out. They couldn't choose C-sections or schedule inductions. They didn't birth in bathtubs with candles. They bled in silence, surrounded by fear, and stitched themselves back together with thread and willpower. That's not toughness. That's tragedy dressed in linen. Still think you'd thrive in medieval times. Picture this: you're 22 in labour with your fourth child kneeling on a floor that smells like goat urine, gripping your sister's arm so hard you break the skin. You've been pushing for hours. The baby's stuck. No one knows why. The midwife mutters something about humours. You see black spots. You pray. And then it's just gone. The sound, the warmth, everything. And someone whispers, "She's with God now." But you're still here listening. So the next time someone complains that birth is too medical these days, feel free to remind them at least the doctor isn't waving sage over your thighs while checking the stars to see if it's a good day to survive. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't about looking good. It was about surviving a social system that judged you faster than a nun spotting a sinner. Clothes were statements, loud, heavy, and often painful ones. They told the world your class, your marital status, and whether you were appropriately ashamed of having a body. Comfort. That was a modern invention. In medieval times, if you weren't sweating, suffocating or scratching, were you even dressed? Let's start with the layers. Because medieval women didn't just get dressed, they assembled. First came the chemise, a long body-length undergarment made of linen designed to absorb sweat, blood and regret. Over that a kirtle, then maybe a surcoat, then a cloak, then a veil, then a wimple, sometimes a belt, sometimes a girdle, and if you were extra unlucky, a piece of armour-like bodice that made breathing optional. Medieval fashion was less about style, and more about surviving a fabric avalanche. And don't let the flowy gowns fool you. Those dresses could weigh 20 to 30 pounds, especially in winter, when wool was layered like sadness. Walking felt like dragging a wet carpet through mud. Sitting was strategic. Running out of the question. Need to pee. Better start undressing by noon if you want to relieve yourself by dinner. Every outfit was a commitment. There was no such thing as a quick change unless it was into your burial shroud. Then there were the materials. Rich women got silk velvet and brocade, stunning fabrics that looked good but trapped heat like a curse. Poorer women wore scratchy wool or coarse flax linen so rough it could exfoliate your soul. Dyes weren't always safe. Lead-based whites, arsenic greens, mercury reds. If the colour didn't kill you, the neighbours would, because certain colours were illegal for the lower classes. Sumptuary laws literally told you what you were allowed to wear depending on your husband's income. Fashion police try fashion executioners. Now let's talk shoes, or as I like to call them, medieval toe coffins. Most were made of leather so thin it barely qualified as protection. Soles were flat, unsupportive, and wore through faster than your will to live. Heels non-existent, arch support. Who needs that when you're already carrying a full cart of potatoes and a crying toddler, and when it rained your feet just soaked? Cold, wet, fungal like marinating your toes in trench soup. Socks were a luxury. Blisters were a lifestyle. And the headwear. Oh, the headwear. You couldn't just walk around with your hair flowing like a shampoo ad. That was scandalous, practically foreplay. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely, often with layers of veils, linen coifs, wimples, and sometimes hats that looked like upside-down flower pots. These weren't light or breathable. They trapped heat lice and every stray crumb from lunch. Some styles were so elaborate you couldn't turn your head without hitting a wall or knocking over a candle. It's hard to flirt when your hat has a wingspan. Hair itself was a battlefield. Unmarried girls wore it loose as a sign of virginity because apparently nothing says purity like being constantly mistaken for a medieval scarecrow. But once married, your hair was to be hidden. Not styled, not cut, concealed. Because hair, temptation and temptation, sin and sin. Your fault, obviously. Some women even pluck their hairlines to achieve that fashionable high forehead look, giving themselves what can only be described as a receding hairline on purpose. Beauty is pain, especially when you're tweezing yourself into social acceptance. Let's revisit the girdle. Not the modern shapewear, but a long cloth or belt wrapped around your waist to hold everything in. Spoiler, it didn't. But it did give men a nice symbol to romanticise. Her virtue is girdled. Translation, she's been cinched and stitched like a sausage, but at least she looks demure while suffocating. Some girdles had religious charms sewn in. Others were studded with bells or trinkets to jingle while you walked, because clearly women weren't being noticed enough. And if you were pregnant, oh boy, maternity wear didn't exist. You just kept wearing your regular clothes until they split at the seams, or you gave birth mid-churn. Some gowns had adjustable laces or panels, but for the most part you just waddled and hoped nothing ripped in front of the Lord's dinner guests. And postpartum wear, you were expected to shrink back into your corset-sized existence, while still bleeding, leaking milk and raising 7 other small humans. Now let's move to chastity belts. Were they real? Probably not widespread, but the myth stuck because it's just believable enough. After all, if a society sees women as walking temptation machines, why not lock up the goods? There's very little solid evidence that metal chastity belts were common, but the idea was so symbolic, so grossly on-brand, that even the fake ones hurt to imagine. Imagine trying to walk, sit or exist with a rusting iron diaper chained to your pelvis. Welcome to patriarchy now in stainless steel. Menstrual wear was, as you can guess, non-existent. Women bled into cloth rags tied with string-stuffed moss between their legs, or just let it flow into their underlayers and hoped the smell didn't attract wild animals. There were no dedicated period outfits. You simply bled in silence and scrubbed the evidence later. If the blood stained your dress, well, now it's a work gown. Medieval women had 2 outfit categories worn to pieces and almost a rag. Let's not forget the symbolism. Every stitch of a woman's clothing screamed social expectation. Tight laces, obedience. Covered hair, modesty. Floor-length gowns, submission. And if you deviated even slightly, you were suspect. Too colourful, vain. Too plain, ungrateful. Too tight, harlot. Too loose, pregnant. There was no winning. Only surviving the fashion gauntlet with as few moral accusations as possible. And yet women found ways to resist. They stitched hidden pockets into gowns, embroidered secret messages into hems, wore rings with poison compartments, and painted subtle messages into brooches. Clothing wasn't just armour, it was a battlefield. And beneath the fabric they were still human. Sweating, chafing, aching for relief. Not just from the linen or the laws, but from the crushing weight of expectation dressed up as virtue. Let's compare. Today you have leggings, breathable fabrics, pockets real ones, bras that sort of fit. You complain about itchy tags. They walked 12 miles in shoes that felt like blister-wrapped regret, and still baked bread for a household of 8. You debate over crop tops. They debated whether removing a wimple would get them stoned. You wear what you want. They wore what they were told to. So next time you get dressed, glance at your closet and feel the blessing. Not just of options or comfort or a tag that doesn't say punishable by law, but the freedom to choose what you wear without begging a priest, a husband, or your neighbour's opinion. Because back then clothes weren't just fashion. They were fences, and every thread reminded you where you belonged. And it definitely wasn't anywhere near comfort. The church. That eternal moral compass that somehow always points to it's the woman's fault. If you lived in medieval Europe, religion wasn't a weekend thing, it was an oxygen thing. It dictated your laws, your lifestyle, your lunch menu and your underwear. And if you were a woman, congratulations. You were born a walking, talking temptation bomb just waiting to ruin everything from piety to crops. If anything bad happened, the explanation was easy. Eve did it, and now you're her understudy. Let's start at the origin story. The Bible, as interpreted by generations of men who'd never menstruated or cleaned up after a toddler, taught that Eve sinned first. She ate the fruit. She tempted Adam. She got them kicked out of paradise. So obviously every uterus since has been held personally responsible for original sin. Women weren't just flawed, they were cosmic liabilities. Want to know why childbirth hurts? Because God's still mad at your great-great-grandmother. Forgiveness. Maybe. But pain. Mandatory. That belief infected everything. Women were considered spiritually inferior, closer to animals than angels. They were said to be more emotional, more gullible, more lustful. Basically, medieval theologians wrote entire treatises arguing that women were soft-brained sex demons who needed men to protect them from themselves. If a woman spoke too confidently, she was prideful. If she stayed silent, she was stupid. If she smiled too much, temptress. If she didn't, ice witch. Pick your heresy. And God forbid, literally, you actually had thoughts. Women weren't allowed to preach. They couldn't hold church office. Most couldn't read the Bible themselves. In fact, for centuries, reading scripture in the vernacular, i.e., something they could actually understand, was illegal. Because apparently, if women read the word of God without a male filter, the heavens would implode. Better to just stick to embroidery and keep your mouth shut during Mass. Even inside the church, women's roles were painfully limited. Nuns had to take vows of obedience, silence and poverty, basically shut up, do chores, and don't enjoy anything. Convents were often ruled by men from the outside, and abbesses had to get male approval for nearly every decision. And yet the church had the audacity to praise female saints who starved themselves, mutilated their flesh, or refused to wash as signs of holiness. Cleanliness might be next to godliness, but not if you were a woman. Then it was vanity. Let's talk sermons. Week after week, priests stood in pulpits and reminded women they were weaker vessels, that their bodies were sinful, that their thoughts were dangerous. Some even preached that a woman's voice was like the hiss of a serpent. No joke. Talking was literal proof of temptation. So women learned to whisper, to shrink, to speak only when spoken to carry shame in their throats like a rosary bead that got stuck. And if you dared to question any of this, you didn't get a theological debate, you got firewood. Women who challenged doctrine, led their own spiritual communities, or simply refused to marry often found themselves accused of heresy or witchcraft. Why? Because independent women clearly had Satan on speed dial. After all, how else would a woman have confidence and opinions unless Lucifer was whispering in her ear? The church also controlled female sexuality like a jealous ex-boyfriend. Women were taught that sex was something to endure, not enjoy. Pleasure was sinful. Desire was dangerous. Virginity was your only real asset until it wasn't, and then you were damaged goods. Married women were told to submit sexually to their husbands as a divine duty. Unmarried women don't even breathe near a man unless you want to be stoned exiled or married to someone twice your age and half your IQ. And let's not forget Mary the Virgin Mother, the one acceptable woman in the church's entire narrative. She was the ideal, pure, obedient, silent, and above all untouched. Women were told to emulate her, which sounds lovely until you realise it means striving for spiritual excellence through complete denial of your body, your desires, and your agency. You weren't supposed to be like Martha working, or like Mary Magdalene thinking. Just be Mary, quiet and perpetually clean. Meanwhile, church art was having a full-blown emotional breakdown over the female form. Women were either depicted as glowing, floaty Madonnas or hell-bound harlots with exposed breasts being clawed at by demons. No in-between. You were either an icon or an infection, and often those lines blurred. St. Agatha, for example, was celebrated for having her breasts cut off and placed on a platter. Men painted that as devotional imagery. Because nothing says faith like a woman's severed body parts being displayed like tapas. Let's talk confession. Women were expected to confess everything. Every impure thought, every accidental lustful gaze, every dream they couldn't control. And their confessors were usually male priests, who would then give them penance, sometimes involving public humiliation. There are records of women being told to walk barefoot through town or sleep in graveyards to atone for their sinful thoughts. That's not redemption. That's gendered humiliation as spiritual entertainment. But perhaps the most brutal part, the internalized guilt. Women came to believe they deserved the suffering, that their pain was holy, that their silence was strength, that to be good they had to be small. And the church loved this, because nothing keeps a system running like convincing half the population that their oppression is virtuous, that obedience is love, that self-erasure is salvation. Now let's compare. Today you can choose your faith. You can read sacred texts in your own language. You can challenge misogyny in the pulpit. You can lead, preach, walk into a church without being told your voice will summon demons. But back then, faith was not a sanctuary. It was a straitjacket lined with scripture. And yet, despite it all, some women found ways to reclaim power. Mystics wrote visions in code. Female saints counselled kings. Nuns ran underground schools. They found loopholes in liturgy, hid knowledge in music, and carved their voices into stone walls, where no man could silence them. They prayed fiercely, loved deeply, and sometimes they even laughed not at God, but at the absurdity of being blamed for all creation's failures, while still expected to clean the altar cloths. So next time someone says the church gave us moral order, you might gently respond, yes, and it also gave us 400 years of telling women they were spiritually contagious. Because history isn't just stained glass, and Gregorian chants, it's the echo of women being told to kneel, not out of faith, but fear. And fear, my friend, wears a crucifix very well. Education in the Middle Ages wasn't just a privilege. It was a fortress surrounded by moats, fire-breathing gatekeepers, and a big no girls allowed sign nailed to the door. If you were a woman, the best you could hope for was learning how to sign your name count to 10, and maybe read a psalm if your dad was feeling generous, and your priest didn't have a stroke at the idea of a literate woman. Because let's be honest, a woman with a book was basically a dragon in disguise. Let's begin with the basics: literacy, ascastes, danger. Not because of the actual reading, but because of what came next, thinking. And God forbid a woman think for herself. Reading led to questions. Questions led to doubts. Doubts led to opinions. And opinions, those led to fires. Real ones, with wood and everything. The church wasn't worried about women being dumb. They were terrified women would get smart. Who got an education? Noble boys, future monks, aspiring clerics. Not girls. Girls were taught household management, which was code for don't spill the stew, don't burn the bread, and definitely don't ask about Pythagoras. A rich girl might learn a bit of Latin or French for a polite conversation, but she wouldn't be encouraged to understand it just to recite it. like a parrot in a very uncomfortable corset. Even in convents, those so-called sanctuaries of learning access to books was limited. Nuns had to borrow scrolls from male monasteries, and the reading list was censored harder than a rebellious teenager's internet access. Theology, maybe. Medicine. Only if it was about childbirth and didn't mention anatomy too graphically. Philosophy? Absolutely not. No one wanted a nun having an existential crisis about gender roles mid-prayer. And let's talk about writing. Women didn't just lack education, they lacked permission. Most weren't taught how to write beyond their names. Many couldn't even do that. Contracts, letters, legal documents, they were all written for women by men. You wanted to write a will. You needed to scribe. You wanted to send a letter. You dictated it, then hoped the messenger didn't laugh halfway through. Your voice on paper belonged to someone else. Now let's roast the idea of female historians in the Middle Ages. There were none. Women didn't get to record history. They were written about usually by sweaty monks with vivid imaginations and zero female interaction. Want to know what a 12th century woman thought about her life, her marriage, her body? Too bad. She wasn't allowed to write it down, and if she did, it was destroyed, ignored, or blamed on demons. Let's meet Hildegard of Bingen, one of the rare exceptions. A nun, composer, scientist and writer, she managed to publish books, write music and correspond with popes and still be considered holy. Why? Because she claimed her visions came from God. Translation. Don't burn me, I'm just the messenger. Her survival strategy was simple. Wrap your intellect in enough divine ecstasy and no one questions it. Unless they do, then you better have incense and a powerful patron. But Hildegard was a unicorn. Most intelligent women had to hide behind pen names, male relatives, or complete silence. Some wrote in secret scratched notes into margins of prayer books, or taught girls in whispered lessons behind monastery walls. A few brave souls published under their husbands' names. Others were caught and accused of witchcraft because they owned too many books, or worse, knew how to use them. Meanwhile, men were debating theology, inventing universities, writing treatises about the weight of angels and conveniently forgetting to invite women to the discussion. The university system was designed to exclude. Women weren't just discouraged from attending, they were legally barred. Oxford number Paris. Don't even try. Your presence in an academic setting was more shocking than a bear in a cathedral. Unless you were serving soup, you didn't belong. And let's not forget the scientific arguments against women learning. Medieval medical texts said women's brains were smaller, cooler, wetter, basically emotional jello. One theory claimed that too much thinking would dry up a woman's womb and render her barren. Another said reading philosophical texts could unbalance her humours and make her insane. So obviously books were a risk to fertility. Because knowledge, infertility, apocalypse. Even when women did manage to get educated, they were shamed for it. She's too clever was an insult. She reads too much was a warning. A learned woman was assumed to be arrogant, sexually deviant, or in cahoots with Satan. Forget the Harvard acceptance letter, just owning a bookshelf was grounds for exorcism. And if she spoke Latin better than a monk, burn her. Burn her now. Let's do a modern comparison. Today, you can download entire libraries to your phone while watching cat videos and eating cereal. You can earn a PhD in astrophysics, post your thesis online, and argue with strangers about Nietzsche in the comments section. Back then, a woman holding a book in public was basically performing an act of civil disobedience. Knowledge wasn't power, it was a liability. And yet women persisted. They taught each other. They passed down herbal knowledge midwifery techniques, astronomy and theology through oral tradition. Mothers taught daughters in secret. Nuns smuggled books between convents. And sometimes they wrote not for fame, but for survival. They wrote prayers, poems, letters and recipes. They documented their lives in margins and songs in lace patterns and coded stitches. Their scholarship was quiet, but it endured. Some men noticed. Occasionally a bishop or scholar would praise a woman's intellect as long as she was pious virginal and preferably dead. Ah, yes, Sister Agnes was brilliant, but also very quiet and submissive as all women should be. The compliments were always boomerangs, they came back with conditions. Meanwhile, boys were being groomed for greatness at cathedral schools. They learned Latin logic rhetoric. They read Aristotle and Augustine. They debated free will and wrote poetry about love they'd never experienced. And the girls, here's how to mend a stocking. Here's how to boil turnips. Here's how to never ever question anything. Education wasn't just withheld. It was weaponized. Keeping women ignorant made them easier to control, easier to blame, easier to erase. And when they finally broke through, when they picked up a pen and wrote anyway, history either forgot them or set them on fire. So next time someone says women didn't contribute much to medieval thought, you can smile sweetly and say, actually, they weren't allowed to contribute. But they did anyway, quietly, brilliantly, and despite every system trying to stop them. Because ignorance wasn't their choice. It was their sentence. You've heard it before. Women back then didn't work. Right. Because waking up before the rooster, milking a goat, gutting a fish, kneading 6 loaves of bread, brewing ale, raising 5 kids, helping with harvest, spinning wool, and not dying from plague before sunset was clearly a spa day. Medieval women worked their calloused fingers to the bone. The only difference, nobody wrote it down. No credit, no paycheck, no job title. Just endless labour disguised as duty. Let's be crystal clear, women were the economy. While men got flashy titles like blacksmith or tanner, women were behind the scenes doing literally everything else. Laundry women, food prep women, childcare, livestock tending, textile production, brewing basket, weaving, herb gathering, all women. And they didn't clock out at 5, they kept going until their bodies gave out, or their husbands stumbled in drunk demanding soup and obedience. In the medieval job market, women were full-time unpaid and always one wrong move away from being called lazy or worse, a witch. Take brewing, for example. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was a staple. Safer than water, cheaper than wine, and consumed by everyone from babies to bishops. And who brewed it? Women. Alewives. Brewsters. They made the beer, sold it from their homes, carried it in buckets to local markets, and managed the bookkeeping. It was one of the only trades women dominated, until it got profitable. Then surprise men decided it was too important to be run by women, shoved them aside, and rewrote history to pretend they were never there. Sound familiar? And then there's textiles, a term that sounds gentle and dainty like embroidery by candlelight. But in reality it was brutal back-breaking work. From shearing sheep to carding wool, spinning thread, weaving cloth, dyeing fabric, it was an assembly line powered by women's unpaid labour. A single tunic could take weeks to produce. And yet when a man wore it, the tailor got the praise. The woman who made the cloth forgotten. Or if she was lucky, remembered as that peasant who's good with yarn. Now let's visit the marketplace. Women sold goods there too. Cheese, butter, vegetables, herbs, ale, candles, even fish. These weren't hobby crafts. They were essential income streams. But the moment a woman made a profit or claimed space too loudly, the whispers started. She's too aggressive. She's not staying in her place. She's probably using sorcery to sell all those cabbages. Centuries later, and some things haven't changed. Women also worked on farms, doing all the same tasks as men, planting, harvesting, hauling, feeding animals, but without the recognition. When a man helped with harvest, he was being productive. When a woman did it, she was helping her husband. This wasn't help. This was labour. But language, like history, was rigged. Let's talk midwifery. It wasn't just delivering babies. Midwives handled everything from prenatal care to childbirth to postpartum support. They managed miscarriages, abortions, complications, and infections. They were surgeons, nurses, therapists, and spiritual guides rolled into one. And while some communities respected them, many treated them with suspicion. A successful midwife could easily be accused of witchcraft. Why? Because she had knowledge and power and wasn't a man. Even in the trades, women showed up. In blacksmithing, carpentry, masonry and apothecary work, especially as widows, who were allowed to take over their late husband's businesses. But even then they were called mistress, not master, and had to constantly prove they weren't just holding the hammer for decoration. If a woman ran a workshop, it was assumed she had a man behind the curtain, because clearly estrogen and entrepreneurship couldn't coexist. Inside noble households, women ran entire estates. Think HR manager, COO and operations executive combined, while also birthing children and pretending they enjoyed embroidery. These women managed food stores, ordered goods, supervised staff, arranged marriages, balanced budgets. But what were they called? Lady of the house. Not a job, not even a thank you, just a title wrapped in lace. And let's not forget servants. Most female servants were glorified pack mules with an apron. Chambermaids, dairymaids, kitchen maids, wet nurses doing every disgusting task their employers couldn't stomach. Cleaning up chamber pots, washing menstrual rags, feeding entitled brats. They worked long hours, ate worse than the family dog, and were paid in crumbs. Literal crumbs. One record mentions a maid being compensated with leftover crusts and access to fire warmth. What a deal! When work overlapped with religion, it got even trickier. Nuns ran hospitals, taught children, copied manuscripts, brewed beer, cultivated herbs, and served the poor. But instead of calling it employment, the church called it devotion. Because if you label labour as holy, you don't have to pay for it. Funny how that works. Let's compare to today. Modern women get underpaid and still face criticism for being too ambitious. Medieval women did all the same work, got zero pay, and were called bossy witches for asking what happened to the missing eggs. You get job titles. They got household labels. You get resumes. They got legacy theft. And yet they showed up every day, before dawn, after dusk. They kept families alive, kept communities running, made, fed, built, healed, and when they died, their work died with them. Unrecorded, unacknowledged, unpaid, but not unnoticed. Because while history books forgot their names, the world they held together still stands. Sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion isn't screaming, it's surviving. So next time someone says, back then men did all the work, just smile and reply, yeah, then who made the bread, the ale, the babies, the clothes, the literal world? Because credit is nice, but surviving without it, that's legendary. So your husband has finally done the one useful thing he was guaranteed to do in this lifetime, die. After years of cooking for him, birthing his children, cleaning his breeches, massaging his ego, and being legally classified as his property, you'd think widowhood would come with fireworks and a freedom sash. And in a way it did. Sort of. Because for the first time, no man owned you on paper. But also, no man owned you, so no man was obligated to feed you, house you, or defend your honour. Welcome to the great paradox of medieval widowhood, free but broke. Let's get one thing out of the way, being a widow is the best case scenario for most medieval women. It was literally the only time a woman over the age of puberty could legally run her own life. No husband breathing down your neck, no father dictating your dinner, no son telling you to just stay home and weave. You could rent property, own a business, even sue someone in court without dragging a male chaperone along. In theory. In practice. That freedom came shackled to poverty's suspicion, and a whole lot of men wondering why you were still breathing. If you were lucky, and by lucky we mean your husband wasn't a complete financial disaster, you might inherit something. A few sheep, half a hut, maybe a third of the vegetable patch and a leaky rain barrel. This was called your dower, and it was supposed to be your safety net. Spoiler, it often wasn't. Husbands could fudge the paperwork, families could contest it, or village elders could conveniently forget your claim. Suddenly your dower became a debate and you became that woman. The one people whispered about behind the baker's stall. She's still living there. Didn't her husband die last Lent? And if you didn't have kids, buckle up. Widows without sons were seen as liabilities. Who would take care of them? Who would inherit their things? Who would keep them in line? The assumption was that a woman couldn't possibly manage a life alone without slipping into witchcraft loose morals, or worst of all, independence. The church loved to preach about pious widows living in prayerful solitude, but society preferred you either remarried or disappeared quietly into a convent. Independence that was unnatural, dangerous, unladylike, dangerous. Of course, remarriage was always on the table, and by table we mean aggressively pushed onto your plate like cold gruel. The moment your husband was buried, male relatives, nosy neighbours, and land-hungry suitors started circling like vultures. Sometimes it was sweet, often it was strategic. Marrying a widow meant getting a house, land or business in one neat little human bundle. Bonus no dowry to pay, and she already knew how to knead bread and hold her tongue. A bargain, unless she refused. Then she was difficult, ungrateful, possibly cursed. But some widows played the game brilliantly. They learned to navigate the legal loopholes and village gossip. They wore black for just the right number of months, cried at the right moments, and slowly, stealthily claimed power. Some became innkeepers, merchants, midwives, or landlords. They ran properties, managed money-built community networks. One famous widow in London even founded a hospital. Another ran a shipping business. These were the exceptions, of course, but they existed. Quiet revolutions in long skirts and aching backs. Still, even the savviest widow couldn't escape the double standard. A man who lost his wife was a tragic figure, a poor soul in need of comfort, and preferably a new cook. A woman who lost her husband, suspicious, lonely, vulnerable, easy target. Medieval literature is full of stories warning against the lusty widow trope, the idea that a woman alone must be on the prowl, ready to seduce men, steal land, and ruin good Christian households, all while tending goats and aging prematurely from hard labour. What a plot twist. And then there was poverty, because let's be honest, most widows weren't founding hospitals or outfoxing village scribes. They were scrounging, picking weeds to eat, bartering hand-sewn linen for firewood, living in one-room cottages with holes in the roof and no one to fix them. Some turned to begging, others to spinning, washing, or midwifery. A few turned to the church, not out of spiritual longing, but because monasteries sometimes offered a bed, soup, and a roof. Not heaven, but better than starving on the steps of the apothecary. And don't forget the widow tax. No, not an actual tax, though. The feudal lords tried that too, but the unspoken cost of simply existing alone. Higher prices at market, less protection on the road, fewer favours. When you no longer belong to a man, you no longer belong to the social fabric. You were untethered, and medieval society hated untethered women, because they asked questions, took up space, reminded everyone that the system could in fact be survived. Even in death, widows got the short straw. A wealthy man died. He got a tomb, a plaque, a carved stone likeness with prayer hands. A woman died. Maybe a name in the parish book. Maybe. Her whole life a life of labour. Childbirth, grief, devotion reduced to the widow of Thomas. No mention of her bread, her strength, her resilience. Just a footnote attached to someone else's life. And yet within this grim landscape there was a strange form of power. Some widows found their voices, refused to remarry, wrote wills, left money to daughters, protected nieces, supported convents or scholars. They became patrons, matriarchs, quiet rebels. The men didn't see it coming. The church didn't know what to do with it, and history didn't bother writing it down. But it happened. Because the moment a woman became a widow, the rules changed, but so did the stakes. With no one left to please and no one left to fear, she could finally look at the world and say, what now? Some folded under the weight. Others carved out new lives with the same hands that once made porridge and prayers. And though the world never thanked them, they carried it anyway. Widowhood wasn't freedom. Not fully, not safely. But it was a doorway. and some women for the first time in their lives walk through it without asking for permission. If you thought the Middle Ages were too busy with famine, war and the Black Death to care about beauty standards, think again. Because even while peasants were digging turnips out of frozen dirt and nobles were dropping dead from bad oysters, women were still expected to be well visibly appealing. Not for themselves, of course, for God, or their husbands, or their future husbands, or that one-eyed merchant with 2 teeth who might be looking for a new wife now that his old one coughed herself to heaven. Because nothing says be desirable like being legally required to reproduce. Let's start with a holy trifecta of medieval beauty, white skin, high forehead and no eyebrows. Yes, you read that right. If your face resembled a pale, hairless moon. Congratulations, you were gorgeous. Peasant women working under the sun all day, too tanned, filthy, common, unworthy. So noble women did everything they could to lighten their complexions. They smeared on mixtures of lead vinegar and egg whites, sometimes even mercury. Because what's a little skin corrosion in the pursuit of a husband-approved beauty? Foreheads were a big deal, like freakishly big. Women plucked their hairlines back with tweezers, razors or hot cloths to make their foreheads appear spiritual. And by spiritual we mean they looked like anxious dolphins. Eyebrows and eyelashes yanked out. Because apparently the less facial definition you had, the more likely you were to be considered morally pure. Who needs expression when you can look like an alabaster statue with anemia? But don't get too attached to this look, because the standards shifted depending on class region, and which dusty monk happened to be writing the latest sermon on vanity. In some places, rosy cheeks were all the rage, suggesting fertility health, and that you probably hadn't died yet. In others, a pinched waist and small bosom were considered ideal, especially if you were meant to look delicate enough to faint in a garden. Which conveniently you might do anyway, after wearing a dress made of 15 layers and 0 breathability. Let's talk about hair, a woman's crowning glory according to the men who never had to braid it, wash it in icy rivers, or detangle it after a lice infestation. Long, golden locks were the fantasy. Virgin Mary chic. But if you dared to wear your hair loose in public, whore. If you cut it short, nun or lunatic. If it turned grey, old crone begone. So most women braided it, wrapped it, or stuffed it under elaborate headdresses that looked like pastry sculptures with social anxiety. Because nothing says humility like balancing 2 pounds of linen on your skull to meet God's fashion requirements. Now here's where it gets fun. Beauty was sin, or at least wanting to be beautiful was. The church preached that vanity led straight to hellfire. So women had to be desirable, but not too desirable. Pretty enough to please your husband, but not enough to inspire lust in the wrong guy. Wear makeup, you Jezebel. Don't wear makeup, you lazy slob. Breathe too confidently near a man's succubus. Exist with a symmetrical face probably possessed. Even smells had a role to play. Scented oils and herbs were popular among upper-class women, lavender, rose, sage. But too much, and you were considered decadent. Not enough, and you reeked like the stable. Some women carried sachets of dried flowers in their dresses to ward off body odour and the plague. Others chewed herbs or dabbed vinegar behind their ears. Because when you can't bathe more than once a season, a medieval woman's beauty regime involved more fermentation than a wine cellar. Let's not forget posture and movement. Graceful walking was essential. You were to glide like a holy vision, not stomp like a plough horse. If you tripped, you were clumsy. If you ran, you were wild. If you spoke loudly, you were brash. If you laughed, harlot. Women were supposed to sit with ankles crossed, eyes lowered, lips closed, unless a man asked a question, in which case you were allowed precisely one sentence and a polite smile. Think swan on the outside, hostage on the inside. Even your teeth mattered. Which is deeply unfortunate considering dentistry in the Middle Ages consisted mostly of prayers and pliers. White teeth were desirable, so women rubbed them with cloth salt or sage. Some recipes even recommended powdered charcoal or ground-up bone. Did it work sometimes? Did it also erode your enamel and make your gums bleed? Absolutely. But But what's a little blood when your smile might earn you a better dowry deal? Now here's the cruelest twist of all: beauty was rarely for the woman herself. It was for the church to show piety, for her husband to prove worth, for society to display virtue. A beautiful woman was proof that her family had done their job, that her father had raised a good daughter, that her husband had acquired a fine ornament, that her sons came from fertile stock. She was less a person and more a mirror reflecting everyone else's expectations but her own. But what if you weren't beautiful by medieval standards? If you were born with dark skin, a broad nose, unruly hair, or a limp, society labelled you cursed, foreign, unclean, or simply unfortunate. You might be ignored, or mocked, or accused of witchcraft just for looking slightly unconventional while stirring soup. And God forbid you had a birthmark or mole in the wrong place. That could land you in a river with your hands tied just to see if you float. And age. That was the final betrayal. A young girl might be celebrated for her skin, her hair, her freshness. But a woman with laugh lines, with calloused hands, with the body of someone who survived 5 births and 2 famines invisible, or worse, distrusted. Age was not seen as wisdom in women. It was seen as decay. The beauty clock struck midnight the moment you stopped bleeding regularly, and suddenly the same society that once praised your fertility now treated you like a haunted barn. But here's the maddening truth no woman won. Not the rich, not the poor, not the chaste, not the wild. Because beauty was a weapon forged by the powerful and handed to women like a gift, when in reality it was a leash. It told them how to act, what to eat, how to age, how to serve. It whispered that their value lived on their skin, their waist, their silence. And even when a woman played the game perfectly, the rules could still change overnight. And despite the pain, the fasting, the plucking, the bleaching, the covering and the concealing, no woman was ever told she was enough. Not truly. Because the system was designed to make sure she never would be. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a romance novel. If anything, it was more like a legally sanctioned hostage situation with witnesses. And when the doors closed and the guests went home, what happened inside the home was no one's business. Or more accurately, no man's business. Because the suffering of women wasn't just tolerated, it was written into custom law and religion. If a husband hit his wife, it wasn't abuse, it was discipline. Like a farmer swatting a mule, like a priest scolding a sinner, like a man asserting his God-given right. Let's be perfectly clear, domestic violence wasn't just common, it was expected. A woman who complained was seen as disobedient. A man who struck was seen as keeping order. The law books agreed. In some medieval legal codes, men were allowed to chastise their wives so long as they didn't maim them. That's right, he could beat her, shake her, imprison her, even starve her as long as he didn't permanently break her. Think of it like a grim maintenance manual oil. The hinges mend the roof, slap the wife when she speaks out of turn. And where was the church in all this watching? Judging, occasionally sermonizing but rarely helping. Medieval clergy often preached that a woman should submit to her husband in all things, that suffering purifies the soul, that obedience is godliness. In this moral math, pain was a virtue. A black eye was a holy trial. A bruised rib was divine instruction. A broken spirit, the price of spiritual salvation. Women were expected to endure in silence. If she screamed, she was hysterical. If she ran, she was wicked. If she fought back, she was dangerous. And if she died a lesson, not a victim. There were no shelters, no advocates, no court orders, just neighbours who heard the blows through the wall and turned up their prayers. And sometimes even they believed she had it coming. Of course some women tried to speak out. But good luck with that. The courts were dominated by men, judges, scribes, lords. A woman's testimony, if she was even allowed to give it, carried less weight than a chicken squawk. She needed male witnesses, proof of injury, and often permission just to appear. And even then the ruling might be go home. Be better. Don't provoke him next time. Cook the stew right. Keep your voice down. don't look too pretty, don't look too plain, just be less, whatever it was that made him snap. In rare cases, where a woman did kill her abusive husband, say after years of torment, she wasn't hailed as a survivor. She was a murderess, a devil, a cautionary tale. Her punishment was swift and public hanging, burning, burying alive. Because if the home was the man's kingdom, then any revolt was treason. Better a dead woman than a disobedient one. And what about the children they watched? They listened. They learned. Sons were taught that power came with fists. Daughters were taught that love came with bruises. And so the cycle spun tight as a spindle, sharp as a blade. A mother wiped her bloody nose and told her daughter, "This is just what men do." A boy saw his father raise a hand and learned that love and violence were twins. And the world kept turning as normal as Tuesday. We mustn't romanticize the peasant village or the noble manor. Abuse wasn't limited by class. A farmer might drag his wife through the dirt. A baron might lock his lady in a tower. A merchant might beat his pregnant wife because the bread burned. A bishop might lecture a trembling girl on obedience while she bled beneath her veil. The methods differed. The message did not your pain is his right. There were songs about it, jokes about it, folk tales where the shrewish wife got her comeuppance with a stick or a frying pan, moral plays where the good woman was silent, patient and battered but still grateful. Beauty was obedience, patience was purity, and pain was proof of your place. But women found ways, small, dangerous, clever ways to resist. Some whispered to each other behind market stalls. Some slipped herbs into his beer to make him sleep deeper. Some prayed not to saints, but to goddesses long forgotten. Some sang lullabies to their daughters that said, "Don't marry young." Some wept into pillows stuffed with straw and swore, "Not my child, not again." It wasn't justice, it wasn't freedom, but it was something. The worst part, many women didn't even call it abuse. There was no word for it, no shared language to name the torment. Just bruises and silence and the slow erosion of self. Just the normalization of being struck, silenced, controlled. Pain was so baked into the identity of womanhood that to question it was to question God himself. And that was the greatest taboo of all. So no medieval women didn't have it easier because they stayed home. The home was often the most dangerous place they could be. It was the cage, the altar, the battlefield. It was where meals were cooked and dreams were strangled, where children were born and love was warped, where women died not always physically but spiritually, emotionally and visibly. And when she stood in church on Sunday with her bruises hidden under wool and shame, no one asked. No one offered refuge. No one even looked her in the eye, because acknowledging her pain meant acknowledging a system that served men and sacrificed women. It meant facing a truth too ugly for comfort and too ancient to untangle easily. But let's be honest, this isn't just a medieval problem. The script has evolved, the costumes changed, but the theme persists. The silence, the shame, the normalization. So when we look back at the bruised women of the past, let's not just pity them. Let's listen to them. Let's hear the echo of their reality in today's headlines, today's courtrooms, today's homes. Because the past isn't dead. It's not even past. And for too many women then and now, Tuesday still hurts. They said witches rode broomsticks, danced with devils, and cursed the crops. But often a witch was just a woman who dared to live outside the lines. Maybe she was too old and unmarried. Maybe she healed the sick with herbs instead of prayers. Maybe she didn't smile when the priest walked by. Or maybe worse yet, she owned land spoke her mind, or lived alone. In medieval Europe, being a woman was already a risk, but being a woman without a man that could get you killed, a mole on your skin, a mark of Satan. A miscarriage. Clearly caused by a curse, your cow died. A neighbour's butter went sour. Someone in the village tripped over their own feet. All signs pointed to witchcraft. And if you'd once muttered under your breath near a sick child or offered a tincture made from dried roots, well, good luck explaining that to the Inquisitor. In a world where science hadn't yet been invented and fear ruled logic, women's knowledge of the natural world was treated like a gateway to hell. The terrifying part, you didn't even have to be guilty. In fact, most of the witches burned, drowned, or crushed to death had done nothing more than survive. Widowhood, infertility, poverty, or simply being disliked were enough to make you suspect. And once suspicion took root, it grew fast. One bad harvest, one deformed birth, one unlucky turn of fate, and the whisper started. She's a witch. And then the church, or the Lord, or the mob took it from there. Trials weren't really about evidence, they were about spectacle. You'd be stripped, searched, prodded for the witch's mark, a freckle, a skin tag, a scar. Then there was the swimming test. Tied up and thrown into water. If you sank, you were innocent, but probably drowned. If you floated, you were guilty and dragged out for punishment. Irony didn't matter. Logic didn't matter. Truth was irrelevant. The goal was control. The method was fear. The victims were almost always women. Sometimes they made you confess, not with persuasion, but with thumbscrews, racks, branding irons. You were shown the tools before they used them, told that pain would cleanse your soul, told that confession would save you even as your body broke under the weight of accusation. And once you confessed, because everyone did, eventually it was over. The sentence might be burning, hanging, or worse, watching your daughter die first. No one really left a witch trial whole. Witch hunts weren't random. They were targeted, political, social, a way to remove women who didn't fit. Midwives, herbalists, caretakers, anyone with knowledge or independence. And always the poor, the voiceless, the ones with no one to defend them. Even women who tried to conform weren't safe. Because you could be loyal to the church, marry young bear 10 children, and still be accused just for being near the wrong rumour. Fear doesn't need facts, it just needs fuel. And society had plenty of fuel. Sermons declared that women were spiritually weaker, and therefore more vulnerable to the devil. The writings of clergymen like Kramer and Sprenger, authors of the Malleus Maleficarum, labelled women as naturally deceitful, lustful, and dangerous. Entire books were written about how to spot torture and eradicate witches' books that didn't question if witches were real, only how best to destroy them. The logic was this: Eve sinned first, and her daughters carry the stain. Therefore, punish them all. What's worse is that women turned on each other, in desperation, in fear, in self-preservation. A neighbour might accuse you to save herself. A midwife might name names to avoid torture. And so the machine kept turning, fueled by betrayal, spinning like a wheel no one could stop. Generations of women lost, erased from memory, reduced to a name in a dusty ledger burned for witchcraft. No crime listed, no defence allowed, just fire and ash and silence. But not every witch burned quietly. Some spat defiance, some laughed in the face of their executioners. Some whispered final curses not to damn their accusers, but to remind the world that they were still human, still women, still wronged. And though the flames consumed their bodies, their stories never entirely vanished. They became ghost tales, folk tales, whispers behind cottage doors. Proof that fear may win battles, but truth lingers. Even today, echoes of those witch hunts remain. In how society treats women who challenge norms, in how powerful women are still called hysterical, difficult, or dangerous, in how female anger is met with suspicion, and female autonomy with backlash. The tools have changed, no more pyres or dunking stools, but the impulse still here, still alive, still ready to flare up whenever a woman steps out of line. So next time you see a freckle on your arm, or find yourself walking alone at night, or speaking a truth that others find uncomfortable, remember this: once that was enough to get you labelled a witch, and once that label was enough to kill you. Not because you were evil, but because you were inconvenient, because you didn't bow low enough, because you lived too freely, and yet they called it justice, they called it protection, They said they were saving souls, preserving peace, upholding divine order. But deep down, we know the truth. It was fear disguised as righteousness. It was patriarchy dressed in robes. It was a system designed not to purify the world, but to control the women in it. So let us not forget the thousands of women who perished not for real crimes, but for existing in a way that made others uncomfortable. Let us say their names, even if history never bothered to record them. Let us honour them not as monsters or myths, but as martyrs to the madness of their time. Because when women are feared more for their wisdom than their weapons, we're never far from the next fire. When we think of medieval warfare, the image that comes to mind is usually a man in armour, sword-drawn banner, flying maybe a horse, rearing dramatically. The battlefield was seen as the domain of kings and knights drenched in blood and glory. But the truth, as always, is more complicated and more inconvenient to those writing the history books, because women fought too, and not just as background noise, not just as victims. They picked up weapons, defended castles, led troops, and died in battlefields only to be pushed to the margins of every chronicle. Start with the sieges. Castles under threat weren't defended solely by moustached men in chainmail. Women poured boiling water from towers, shot arrows through slits in the stone, and carried supplies up crumbling stairwells. They tended wounds while standing ankle-deep in mud and blood. And when no men were left, they didn't wait for rescue, they organised defences themselves. Some disguised themselves in armour, others didn't bother hiding at all. The goal wasn't glory, it was survival. Then there were the peasant uprisings, the forgotten rebellions where women fought not for a crown, but for a crust of bread. In the 14th century Jacquerie revolt in France, and during England's peasants' revolt, women stood beside men wielding farm tools and makeshift clubs. They raided manor houses, burned tax records, and in some cases struck down the lords who had ruled them with iron fists. But when the chroniclers wrote of these events, they wrote the people rose up as if women were not part of the people, as if rebellion itself had a gender. Of course, there were famous exceptions names that managed to claw their way through centuries of erasure. Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who led French troops against the English and changed the course of a war. But even Joan was a reluctant symbol remembered more for her execution than her victories. And once burned at the stake, she was safely dead easier to canonise, less dangerous than a living girl who had bested kings. History has a way of loving its heroines only after they've been silenced. Other female warriors didn't even get statues or sainthood. Marguerite de la Roche abandoned on an island with a gun, and a knife defended herself from beasts and hunger for 2 years. Tomoe Gozen of Japan rode into battle with a curved blade and decapitated enemies, but Western textbooks prefer to pretend she never existed. In Spain, the women of Zaragoza resisted Napoleon's army with muskets and fire, and in countless small towns across medieval Europe, unnamed women fought in defence of their families, their homes and their bodies. But the scrolls were silent. Why? Because war was a performance of masculinity. Victory belonged to men. Sacrifice was credited to them. When women acted with violence or valour, they disturbed the script. A woman with a sword was either an anomaly or an embarrassment. So the scribes edited them out. Or worse, rewrote them as victims or witches or mad women. Because a woman who wielded power threatened more than just the enemy, she threatened the social order. And yet women continued to show up where they weren't expected. As spies, messengers, saboteurs. They poisoned wells and delivered false letters, smuggled intelligence between battlefronts, and hid fugitives in cellars. Their warfare wasn't always waged with blades, it was silent, strategic, and often more effective than the clash of armour. But history doesn't count what it can't romanticise, and the idea of a mother slipping poison into a tyrant's cup doesn't fit the hero's tale. In besieged cities, women became the last line of resistance. They refused to flee. They buried the dead and then kept fighting. When their husbands were slaughtered, they didn't mourn, they retaliated. Some disguised themselves as men to enlist cutting their hair and binding their chests. Others didn't bother hiding because there was no one else left. The battlefield doesn't ask for gender when death is imminent. But history obsessed with lineage and hierarchy always did. Even in naval battles, women stowed aboard ships. Some were pirates commanding crews and striking terror in seas ruled by men. Saïda al-Hurra and Bonnie Jeanne de Clisson, all real, all formidable. But their stories were whispered passed down through rumour rarely inked with respect. If a woman succeeded in war, she was labelled unnatural. If she failed, she was conveniently forgotten. The worst part wasn't just the forgetting, it was the rewriting. Women's participation was often reduced to romantic subplots. If they were mentioned, it was as wives who inspired men, or mourners who wept for them. Their acts of violence were sanitized, their leadership softened. Joan of Arc wasn't just a general, she was rebranded as a mystic. Noble women who commanded fortresses were described as holding out bravely but not strategizing. Because to admit a woman could lead soldiers was to admit she could lead, period. And that was dangerous. What does that erasure cost us more than historical accuracy? It robs generations of women of their legacy. It tells girls that courage wears a beard and rides a stallion, and that their ancestors were only ever passive. It narrows the story of humanity into half its truth. It teaches us that to be fierce is to be male, and to be female is to wait at home silent and breakable. But the bones in medieval battlefields tell another story. So do the letters, the folk songs, the scars. And maybe that's why women's war stories persist not in textbooks, but in ballads and whispered legends. Old songs about mothers who lifted axes, folk tales about sisters who rescued brothers, local myths where the town's salvation began with a girl and a plan. These aren't just stories. They're fragments of truth that refuse to stay buried. Because while history may be written by the victors, memory belongs to everyone. Even today, the legacy continues. Women in modern militaries still face disbelief, dismissal, or outright exclusion. Their leadership is questioned. Their valour is doubted. But it's not new. It's a continuation of an ancient script that refused to see women as warriors. And yet, despite centuries of censorship, women keep showing up on battlefields in revolutions in resistance. Because survival is its own kind of war, and women have always known how to fight. So the next time someone says women didn't fight in the Middle Ages, remind them they did. In the mud, in the smoke, in the silence. They picked up swords when no one else would. They fought for homes they would never inherit. They bled for kings who wouldn't name them. And though history turned its head, their ghosts remain unrecorded but undefeated. To the average medieval observer, the nun was a symbol of purity and devotion, quiet, veiled, detached from the chaos of the world. She was a woman who had chosen God over man, prayer, over pleasure, solitude, over society. But peel back the layers of incense and cloistered silence, and you'll find something far more complex. Because beneath the wimples and vows was an entire ecosystem of politic survival, and in some cases, subversion. The life of a medieval nun was rarely as simple or as holy as the stained glass windows claimed. For starters, many women didn't choose the nun life. It chose them by force, by poverty, or by paternal decree. If you were a nobleman's fourth daughter with no dowry, the convent was your destiny. If your family couldn't afford a wedding, the church became your groom. And if you were too rebellious, too clever, or too loud for your father's taste, the nunnery was a convenient way to lock away your defiance under the guise of holiness. Entering the convent was often less a calling and more a convenient burial of a woman's worldly potential. But once inside, nuns did more than pray. They managed estates, copied manuscripts, educated girls, and ran hospitals. Some became abbesses, powerful women who ruled over land labour and wealth, rivaling male clergy in influence. These weren't shrinking violets whispering psalms in the dark. These were CEOs in habits navigating feudal politics while pretending to care only for scripture. And in some convents especially, those tied to aristocracy, Political intrigue thrived like mould on bread. In fact, the cloister became one of the few spaces where women could wield unchallenged authority, so long as it was wrapped in religion. Behind those high stone walls, women created their own hierarchies, rivalries and alliances. An ambitious abbess could become a regional power broker, influencing local bishops, manipulating noble families and even defying kings. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, corresponded with emperors and popes, wrote theological texts, composed music and ran her convent like a fortress of intellectual rebellion. Her story wasn't rare, it was just inconvenient to tell. Of course not every nun enjoyed such influence. For many the convent was a place of relentless monotony and rigid obedience. The rule of St. Benedict dictated silence, fasting, physical labour and midnight prayers. Meals were sparse, beds were hard, laughter was frowned upon. The idea was to kill the body so the soul could thrive. But not all nuns were on board with this holy masochism. Some rebelled quietly or dramatically, others escaped, and a few even staged hunger strikes or riots when conditions became unbearable. Celibacy, too, was less straightforward than the Church liked to pretend. For some women, the vow of chastity was a relief, a sanctuary from forced marriage and endless childbirth. But for others, it was a cruel denial of desire and humanity. Affairs between nuns and priests happened. So did secret romances with laymen. So did relationships between women. And while the Church wagged its finger, it also often looked the other way, especially if the nuns in question came from noble families. Reputation mattered more than righteousness. Then there was the matter of visions and mysticism. In a world where women's voices were silenced, claiming divine inspiration became a loophole. If you said God was speaking through you, suddenly your words carried weight. Women like Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena found power not by preaching but by channeling celestial authority. They wrote treatises, advised popes and challenged corruption, all while technically staying in their place. Mysticism was risky, yes, but it was also one of the few forms of expression allowed to women whose mouths were otherwise sewn shut by tradition. And what about the art nuns were not just passive receivers of male theology? They were writers, painters, composers. Convents produced illuminated manuscripts so intricate they rival the work of male monks. Women copied scripture, translated Latin, and in some cases authored original works, though many remained anonymous. Their creativity wasn't decorative, it was devotional. But it also served as a kind of resistance, a quiet proclamation that women too could think, could create, could immortalize beauty and meaning. Life inside a convent also came with strange contradictions. While women were told to renounce vanity, many convents maintained ornate chapels, embroidered vestments and rich altars. While they vowed poverty, noble nuns often brought personal wealth into the cloister. And while they preached humility, the abbess might wear a jewelled ring and wield a staff of authority. These weren't flaws, they were features. They revealed the delicate balancing act of being a woman under patriarchy, holy but not too holy, powerful but never too visible, obedient yet always strategizing. Some convents became sanctuaries for fallen women, widows, ex-nobles, survivors of scandal. Others were little more than prisons for politically inconvenient girls. But in between those extremes, something remarkable happened. Community. In an age where most women's lives revolved around men, the convent was one of the few places where women lived together, worked together, and aged together. They shared chores, secrets, prayers, and songs. And while not all loved the life, many found something resembling sisterhood in the silence. It's easy to romanticize the nun's life as peaceful, pious, and detached from the violence of the outside world. But nuns were not untouched by politics. They were pawns in church reforms, victims of noble feuds and targets during periods of anti-clerical violence. During the Reformation, many convents were raided or dissolved. Nuns were forced to marry, flee or die. Centuries of female labour and intellectual output were erased or repurposed. Libraries burned. Cloisters crumbled, and again history moved on pretending they were never there. Even today, the legacy of medieval nuns is complicated. On the one hand, they were complicit in a system that suppressed female agency and exalted suffering. On the other, they carved out a space for women to live, learn and lead in ways the secular world denied them. Their silence wasn't always submission, their chastity wasn't always consent, and their prayers, sometimes they were just well-disguised screams. So next time someone suggests that medieval women were passive docile saints in waiting, remember the nuns. The ones who copied books by candlelight with frostbitten fingers. The ones who smuggled messages in loaves of bread. The ones who turned their convents into miniature kingdoms of thought and influence. And the ones who, despite being cloistered, managed to reach across the centuries to whisper we were here. We mattered. Because silence, when chosen, can be power. Celibacy, when embraced, can be liberation. And even within the walls built to contain them, medieval nuns found cracks wide enough for light, for words, and for legacy to slip through. In the medieval world, sex education wasn't so much education as it was an awkward collision of folklore fear and religious dogma. There were no diagrams, no open discussions, and certainly no pamphlets handed out by kindly teachers. Instead, young girls, many barely old enough to understand their own bodies, were ushered into womanhood by vague warnings and suspicious looks. If you were lucky, an older woman in the village might whisper something cryptic about what men do at night, as if sex were a curse passed in riddles. The rest you were left to figure out between marriage, childbirth, and your own suffering. The church loomed over all of it, of course, eager to define sex as both sacred and sinful, usually at the same time. Sex within marriage, technically allowed, but only for reproduction, enjoying it. That was already straying into mortal sin territory. Outside of marriage, absolute damnation. Lust was a fire set by Satan, and women naturally were the kindling. Medieval theology taught that Eve's desire ruined paradise, so every daughter of Eve was expected to carry that shame like a shadow on her womb. Medical understanding of the body, especially the female body, was a nightmarish blend of Galenic theory superstition and YW don't ask. Women were thought to be colder, wetter, and more unstable than men emotionally and anatomically. Their wombs wandered, their humours boiled. If a woman was too lustful, it was because her uterus was misbehaving. If she wasn't lustful enough, well, maybe her uterus was still misbehaving. The ancient Greek idea of the hysterical woman lived on, tangled in a fog of ignorance and mouldy manuscripts. Sexuality was medicalized in ways that sound absurd now, but were deadly serious then. Doctors and clergy alike warned that too much sex could melt the brain, cause blindness, or drain a man's vital essence, because semen, you see, was considered a kind of holy sap too precious to waste. Meanwhile, female desire was either non-existent or monstrous, depending on who you asked. Some texts described women as naturally modest, uninterested in carnal pleasure. Others insisted women were insatiable temptresses who would seduce monks with their eyes and drag souls straight to hell. Pick a lane, gentlemen. Girls were often married before they even knew how babies were made. They entered the bridal chamber with no knowledge of anatomy, no sense of consent, and a deep fear of sin. If they asked questions, they were told to be quiet. If they cried, they were told to pray. And if they resisted, they were told that this was their duty as wives and future mothers. Pain, confusion, and shame were normalized, and heaven help the girl who became pregnant and still had no idea what had happened to her body. Men didn't fare much better, truth be told. Young boys were often taught about sex through gossip violence, or exposure to brothels, sometimes with the enthusiastic support of their fathers. Boys were praised for virility, girls punished for curiosity. The double standard was medieval to its core, and because no one really knew how bodies worked, just how they were supposed to behave, according to scripture, misconceptions ran rampant. For instance, many believed that a woman could not become pregnant unless she climaxed. which meant, of course, that rape victims who became pregnant were often accused of secretly enjoying it. That same logic bled into legal and religious rulings where the line between consent and blame was blurred beyond recognition. Courts sometimes asked rape victims if they screamed loudly enough, fought back hard enough, or tried to escape. If not, their silence or survival was treated as complicity. Virginity became a legal tool and a moral weapon. A woman's worth was measured by the tightness of her body and the quietness of her tongue. Her blood on wedding sheets on courtroom floors became proof of either innocence or guilt, depending on who was looking. Meanwhile, the actual mechanics of sex were buried in myth. Men were taught that male pleasure was central and sacred. Women were not taught at all. There were no discussions about consent, arousal, or mutual pleasure, just duty and shame. Many women went their entire lives without knowing that their bodies were capable of desire, let alone satisfaction. And the few who did know better were usually labelled witches, harlots, or worse, independent. The church preached abstinence outside of marriage, but also used fear and superstition to control sexuality. Masturbation, a mortal sin that could summon demons. Premarital sex grounds for excommunication and public shaming. Even dreams were suspect. Nocturnal emissions were considered a spiritual crisis for monks and young men who were expected to fight their unclean urges with prayer, fasting, and self-flagellation. And if you were a woman dreaming about anything remotely physical, best hope no one found out. That way lies heresy. Brothels were paradoxically tolerated in many medieval cities because, as some authorities put it better, the men go to whores than corrupt our daughters. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil, a pressure valve to prevent worse sins, but prostitutes themselves were shunned, taxed, and punished. They were denied burial in consecrated ground, barred from other women's company, and often blamed for spreading disease. Yet some were more educated in anatomy and herbs than the doctors of their time. These women understood more about sex, pregnancy, and contraception than the priests lecturing against them from gilded pulpits. Sexuality was also shaped by deeply rooted fears of the body. Bodily fluids were seen as dangerous, especially those from women. Menstrual blood was considered toxic, capable of spoiling crops, tarnishing mirrors, and driving dogs mad. Semen was sacred. Vaginas were suspicious. Anything moist, hidden, or bleeding was cause for moral panic. Hygiene was rarely discussed in meaningful ways, and women who asked too many questions were labelled impure or worse, curious. And yet despite all this, there were moments, small flickering, where women carved out knowledge of their own. In private circles, midwives and herbalists passed on wisdom through whispered lessons. They knew which herbs could delay a period and a pregnancy or ease pain. They understood the rhythms of the body in ways the church refused to acknowledge. But their knowledge was fragile, always at risk of being labelled witchcraft. The line between healer and heretic was perilously thin. In monasteries, some male scholars did attempt to map the body-writing treatises on reproduction and anatomy. But they often used animal metaphors, misunderstood menstruation, and described the uterus like a second mouth-hungry, unruly, dangerous. Women's bodies were portrayed as inverted, defective versions of male bodies. The clitoris was barely mentioned. Pleasure, when acknowledged at all, was considered a moral hazard. No wonder generations of women grew up thinking sex was something done to them, not with them. And because the body was seen as the enemy of the soul, sex was always under suspicion. The more you desired, the more corrupt you were. The less you enjoyed it, the holier you became. Women were praised for being chaste, but punished for not being fertile. They were warned against seducing men, but also blamed if their husbands strayed. It was a house of mirrors, all pointed at them, all reflecting back a twisted version of who they were told to be. What passed for sex education in the medieval world wasn't just inadequate, it was actively harmful. It shamed curiosity, it silenced victims, it upheld double standards with divine justification, it spread ignorance under the name of purity. and it left a legacy that still echoes in some corners of the world today, where shame is passed down like scripture and silence mistaken for virtue. But even in the murk of medieval misunderstanding, some women found ways to speak. Through songs, through stories, through secret knowledge kept in gardens and kitchens. They passed on what they knew not through scrolls but through survival. And they whispered to their daughters, "You're not a sin. You're not a curse. You're a body and a soul and a mind. You deserve to know yourself." And that somehow was the most radical lesson of all. In theory, medieval justice promised fairness under divine and earthly law. In practice, if you were a woman, justice was a ghost whispered about, never seen and rarely served. Courts were dominated by men, male judges, male scribes, male clerics presiding over laws written by men for men and usually against women. The system wasn't just stacked. It was practically a fortress, its gates locked to anyone without a beard and property. A woman's voice in court was often treated like background noise, especially if it challenged a man's word. If a woman accused a man of wrongdoing, be it theft, assault, or worse, she faced immediate scrutiny not just of her claim but of her character. Was she modest? Was she a virgin? Was she sober? Had she ever smiled at the accused? Had she ever been alone with him? These questions weren't rhetorical. They were the pillars of the system built to shift blame from the perpetrator to the victim. A woman was expected to prove her innocence, not the man's guilt. The law held a twisted logic that a woman's virtue was more valuable than her voice. If she could not produce witnesses, or if her story contradicted male testimony, her case often collapsed. In some places, the testimony of 2 or more women equaled that of one man unless the man was noble and the women were not. In rape cases, unless the victim screamed loudly enough to alert others, or unless her body bore wounds, she was often dismissed. Physical resistance became the only acceptable proof of moral resistance. Silent suffering meant consent, at least in the eyes of the court. In many regions, especially under canon law, rape wasn't treated as a crime against the woman. It was a crime against her father or husband, a violation of property. The damage was reputational and transactional. If the woman was unmarried, her marriage prospects were damaged, meaning compensation had to be paid not to her, but to her male guardian. If she was married, the offence was considered adultery regardless of consent. The man who raped her might be fined, but the woman could be punished too for allowing her husband's honour to be soiled. Widows, paradoxically, had slightly more legal standing, but only because they no longer belonged to a man. They could appear in court, represent themselves in property disputes, and sometimes win. But even then, success depended on wealth, social standing, and a carefully preserved reputation. Poor or working-class women fared far worse. If they spoke up, they were labelled quarrelsome, mad, or immoral. If they stayed silent, the injustice rotted beneath the surface, unspoken and unresolved. Most chose silence. It was safer. Punishments were also gendered not just in practice, but in design. A man accused of theft might face public flogging. A woman accused of gossip. She might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted around her head with a tongue press jammed into her mouth. Her crime was speech. Her punishment was humiliation. For women, shame was justice. Whether it was stocks, ducking stools, or public pillories, the goal was to make her body the spectacle and her silence the lesson. Domestic violence wasn't seen as a crime. It was seen as discipline. Husbands were allowed encouraged even to correct their wives. As long as he didn't kill her, a man could beat his wife for disobedience, for perceived disrespect, or simply for speaking out of turn. The law gave him leeway. The church gave him justification. The community gave him approval. If a woman complained, she was often told to pray harder, to obey better, or to endure longer. Her suffering was private business, not public concern. Adultery laws were another battlefield of injustice. If a man strayed, he might be gently scolded or ignored, especially if he was wealthy. If a woman strayed, she faced ruin. Even suspicion could lead to exile, shaving of the head, or public penance. In some regions, she was forced to walk the streets in nothing but a shift, holding a candle, reciting her sins aloud. The shame was collective. Her body became a warning, her walk a sermon. No one asked why she strayed. They only watched her fall. Then there were the trials by ordeal, the medieval method of divine judgment. Did a woman swear she was innocent? Let her carry a hot iron across the room. If her wounds healed cleanly, she was pure. If they festered, she was guilty. Or perhaps she was thrown into a river bound hand and foot. If she floated, she was a witch. If she sank, she was innocent, but dead. Women were subjected to these rituals more often than men. Their crimes were tied to their bodies, their punishments written in fire and water. Some legal codes even codified misogyny with a smirk. In parts of medieval Europe, a woman could not charge a man with slander unless she had 4 male witnesses. A man could accuse his wife of infidelity with little or no proof. She in turn needed miraculous evidence to clear her name. And if she retaliated verbally, physically, or legally, she was labelled a shrew, a harpy, or worse, a woman who didn't know her place. Justice for women was a labyrinth with no exit. Not all women were entirely without recourse. Some noble women, especially those with wealth and powerful families, could influence courts, bend judgments, even file suits. In rare cases, abbesses and female landowners acted as legal authorities over their domains. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule. For the vast majority, justice was inaccessible unless they were content with scraps, or revenge served quietly behind closed doors. Many women resorted to their own systems, alliances with other women, whispered warnings, protective magic, or subtle defiance. Even in death, injustice lingered. A murdered woman's worth was measured in coins, literally. The weregild, or man price, was often lower for women. Her blood was cheaper, her name forgotten faster. Her tombstone might list her as wife of or daughter of, but rarely her own person. Justice in the end was not blind. She was just uninterested in listening. And so women lived with injustice, not as an aberration, but as an expectation. They watched their sisters punished for survival. They watched their daughters trained in silence. They buried their stories beneath the weight of law and fear, and still they endured. They found ways to live inside the cracks. They carved out spaces, however small, where dignity could breathe. Justice may not have been theirs, but resilience was. Sometimes that resilience took the form of quiet protest, a woman who refused to confess to a sin she did not commit. Sometimes it was survival against the odds, a mother shielding her daughter from a predator the courts wouldn't name. And sometimes it was laughter, biting, knowing, and fierce at the absurdity of a world that claimed women were weak, while it feared their every word. These moments weren't justice, but they were something like defiance. And in a system built to erase them, defiance was power. Because justice, as the men of the time defined it, was never meant for women. It was meant to protect property, legacy, and control. Women threatened all 3. They bled, they birthed, they remembered. And no matter how the courts ruled or the priests preached, they kept telling stories. One whispered truth at a time, one stubborn voice refusing to go quiet. Justice didn't come, but truth survived. They were never handed swords, nor laws, nor pulpits, but they fought. In kitchens and convents, in whispers and gardens, with herbs, with stories, with silence that screamed medieval women pushed back. Not with fanfare or open revolution, but with the cunning of those who knew the rules were stacked against them. Resistance came not in banners, but in bread, baked differently in scrolls, copied at midnight in a single glance that defied everything. This was a quiet war, and it was everywhere. The most radical act a woman could do was survive. To endure a world that dismissed her thoughts, dictated her body, and measured her worth in dowries and obedience, yet still wake still, create still dream, was resistance. It was in the widow who refused remarriage, managing her late husband's estate with more acumen than any lord nearby. It was in the midwife who memorized healing rituals forbidden by the church. It was in the girl who taught her sister to read using scraps of parchment and candle stubs. Every act of self-possession in a world that wanted her to disappear was a crack in the wall. Midwives were more than healers. They were archivists of forbidden knowledge. They knew the turning of the womb, the secret of fevered brows, the herbs that calmed bleeding and coaxed birth. In a time when male physicians dismissed female pain as hysteria or divine punishment, these women held the real science. They passed remedies hand to hand, voice to voice in kitchens and fields. The state tried to erase them. The church called them witches, but they kept saving lives anyway. Even nuns resisted in the only ways allowed. Within convent walls, some found a refuge from marriage violence or poverty. And once inside, many wrote painted, composed music and even advised kings. Behind the veil, some of the most educated women in Europe preserved knowledge, penned subversive texts, and questioned theological doctrine through poetry and prose. These weren't quiet prayers. These were sharp minds, sharpening each other, cloaked in divine protection. The habit became armour. Women fought back with stories, and stories travelled faster than swords. A tale told by the hearth could outlast the king who silenced her. Folklore became coded rebellion of clever wives, trickster maidens, daughters who outwitted tyrants. These weren't just fairy tales. They were mirrors and warnings carried on the breath of grandmothers and girls. Every story passed down without permission was a declaration: you may control our bodies, but you will never own our memory. Many women turned to the one-power men feared most knowledge. Some disguised themselves as men to attend universities. Others studied in secret reading manuscripts hidden beneath beds or inside sewing chests. Literacy was dangerous in female hands. It gave shape to thought, to protest, to preservation. The woman who could read could document abuse. The woman who could write could rewrite her own ending, and so literacy for many was a candle in a locked room. Clothing itself became a silent weapon. Women embroidered secret symbols into their gowns, spiritual charms, ancestral motifs, tiny icons of resistance. They wore herbs braided into their hair, not just for scent, but for medicine and meaning. Veils could hide bruises. Bodices could conceal tools. Even silence could be intentional, a shield against confession, a refusal to flatter a stand against the script. Every act of choice in how they dressed was a line rewritten in their own language. Some women fought back with laughter. Satire and song became weapons sharper than any blade. In village festivals and tavern corners, female singers mocked the local priest's hypocrisy, the Lord's gluttony, the absurdity of marriage laws. Their voices were too clever to silence directly, so they were dismissed as jesters. But their words lingered. Humour became camouflage for truth too dangerous to speak plainly. And the people remembered what they sang. Others turned to their kitchens, not just for sustenance, but for alchemy. Women understood fermentation, preservation, distillation. They created recipes that outlived plagues. They discovered healing concoctions later claimed by male physicians. They were chemists without degrees, herbalists without titles, nutritionists without scrolls. And they taught these secrets with precision and love, turning ordinary households into laboratories of survival. Their food wasn't just nourishment. It was legacy. Motherhood itself became rebellion. To raise a daughter with tenderness in a world that taught her to fear herself was a revolutionary act. Mothers taught girls when to speak, when to nod, when to hide the truth, and when not to. They taught how to mend a wound, read a glance, walk away slowly from danger. In lullabies, they whispered the truths too dangerous for daylight. And in their arms, girls learned that the world outside might be cruel, but they were never alone. Wives pushed back against brutal husbands with stealth and steel. Some added just enough foxglove to dull his rage. Others escaped at dawn with children bundled in cloaks, disappearing into abbeys or across borders. When caught, they faced punishment. But many succeeded. and the ones who stayed learned the art of endurance, turning compliance into camouflage, waiting until the right moment to act. Survival wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Resistance echoed in art as well. Women painted biblical scenes where Eve was wise, not wicked. They crafted tapestries of heroic maiden saints who bled and survived. They carved hidden initials into altarpieces and illuminated manuscripts with quiet defiance. Their hands worked within rules, their minds broke them, and each brushstroke, each needlepoint, each note played beneath stained glass was a fingerprint left behind in protest. Even prostitution, often seen as the lowest rung, became a space of strange agency. In brothels, women created networks, shared knowledge, protected each other from the worst clients. Some ran their own establishments, managing income and wielding more freedom than married women. They navigated society's scorn with a mix of business savvy and brutal realism. In a world that commodified their bodies, they chose to profit on their own terms. Not freedom, but not submission either. Some women found strength in religion, not the parts that condemned them, but the parts that freed. They saw in Mary Magdalene not a whore, but a witness. In female saints, not martyrs, but warriors. They prayed to goddesses remembered only in local legends, carved into stones half buried in earth. Their spirituality was layered, official by day, ancestral by night. It offered comfort, mystery, and above all, autonomy of soul. Faith for them was not submission, it was sanctuary. And then there were the letters. Secret letters between sisters, between lovers, between mothers and daughters, torn apart by marriage or war. Written in codes, in poetic phrasing, or in plain longing. These scraps of parchment carried hope, instruction, memory. The church might condemn the tongue, but the hand could still speak. In letters, women gave advice, offered comfort, promised escape. They documented what history books ignored, and in doing so they built their own archive. Not all resistance was hidden. Some women stood in court and refused to cry. Some stood in marketplaces and shouted the truth. Some pulled swords from walls and led peasant revolts. Others simply stood still unbroken as everything around them tried to bend their will. Not all succeeded, but each act, large or small, whispered to the next generation, "You are not powerless. You are not alone." The resistance was not a movement. It was a murmur. It flowed through generations like a stream beneath frost, quiet but unstoppable. Mothers passed it to daughters. Midwives passed it to apprentices. Sisters passed it in gestures, songs and warnings. It was the resistance of breath, of presence, of being alive and unbowed, in a world that tried every day to erase them. It did not need banners. It needed memory, and memory in the end is what carried them. The stories whispered in shadow, the recipes folded into cookbooks, the names scratched into wood, beneath floorboards. These were the footnotes of defiance. No laws were passed in their name, no statues carved in their honour. But without their quiet resistance, the world would have forgotten how to change. They were never the heroines in the epics, but they were the reason the epics survived. So when history books ask why didn't women fight back, the answer is simple. They did, in every way they could, and they still do. Let's not romanticize it. Being a woman in the medieval world was not a Netflix costume drama. It was blood-bone survival. No running water, no rights, no plan B, no safe word, no therapy. If you were lucky, you were born into a family that didn't sell you off before your first moon cycle. If you were really lucky, you learnt to read Dodge childbirth fever, and maybe lived past 40 without being called a witch. But luck in this world was not gentle. It was a scratch of sunlight on a prison wall. So would you survive? That depends on what you think survival means. If it's about staying alive, breathing day to day, scraping bread from a wooden bowl and nodding at the priest even when he condemned your body, maybe. Millions did. They hauled water, birthed babies, stitched wounds, cleaned filth, and bore the weight of systems designed to never thank them. They did it in silence mostly. Survival was not a prize. It was the default setting. But if survival means more than that, if it means keeping your spirit intact, your mind awake, your laughter unchained, then the odds get thinner. Because the world around you would try to crush those things first. It would tell you your mind is not yours, your body is not yours, your name belongs to your husband, and your words are dangerous. You would learn to nod at the right times, hide your anger and cry where no one could see. You would learn to make allies out of bread, silence, and the occasional herbal tea. What kind of woman would you be? A noble woman in a draughty stone hall watched by servants, and married to a man chosen for diplomacy. You would have fur cloaks but no privacy. A peasant barefoot and sunburnt praying for rain, or praying it would stop. Your hands would be calloused by age 12. A nun with ink-stained fingers in a quiet scriptorium reciting psalms in Latin, but dreaming of running rivers, or a midwife slipping through alleys at night carrying secrets in your satchel, and the church's suspicion on your back. The role didn't matter as much as the resilience. Could you survive the silence? Because that's what most of it was. Not the silence of peace, but of being unheard. Of watching your brother praised for saying something you said an hour earlier. Of whispering warnings to your daughters and pretending it's just what women do. Of watching justice pass by your door like a parade you're not invited to. Of being the one who always cleans the blood but never gets to ask why it was spilled. That silence. It was louder than a battlefield. Would you survive childbirth? Statistically, not always. No pain relief. No sterile gloves. Just hope a midwife with steady hands and a prayer that the church wouldn't condemn your scream as immodest. You might die giving life. Or live and bury 3 children before your 30th birthday. You'd hold death in one arm and stir porridge with the other. And when people said God's will, you'd smile and pretend not to feel the betrayal in your bones. Could you survive marriage, not the wedding that's just linen and hymns, the marriage, the expectation to obey, to smile, to stay, even when his fists replaced his words, even when your dowry was spent and your body wasn't yours, divorce. Not a thing unless you had serious money or a miracle, so you stayed, or you disappeared, or you waited long enough to outlive him and claim some land for yourself. Widowhood, ironically, was the closest thing to independence. Would you survive beauty standards that made you shrink yourself? Not just physically, though corsets and starvation were very real, but spiritually. To be pretty but not vain, chaste but not frigid, fertile but not demanding, quiet but not simple. Every day was a tightrope walk over fire, and no matter how well you performed, the chorus of judgment sang on. Even saints had to be soft, bleeding, and humble, especially the female ones. And yet some did more than survive. They sang, scribbled, carved, healed, dreamed. They resisted not with weapons, but with wit endurance, and the long memory of women who never forgot each other. They survived by building small empires from scraps, a garden, a song, a daughter who could read. They bent the rules without breaking so loudly as to be noticed. They carved out life in a world that kept trying to define death for them. Their stories remain even if unnamed. So would you survive as a medieval woman, maybe? But that's not really the right question. The question is, why did they have to fight so hard just to be human? Why was survival their only mode? And what do we carry from their struggle that still shapes the world we live in now? Because the truth is, some of us are still fighting. Still told to be small, agreeable, pretty silent. Still surviving systems dressed in new robes. Still wondering if our anger is too loud, our power too inconvenient. But if they could carry on barefoot through plague war and prayer-soaked patriarchy, maybe we can carry them forward. Not just their suffering, but their stubborn brilliance. Not just their wounds, but their wisdom. You might have survived or not, but you would not have been alone.